I'd like to go ahead and bring up Atika for the first talk. And we'll be stepping back into the background and facilitating. So we'll speak to you on the other side, I guess.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I presume everyone can. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful to DSA for organizing this virtual conference, especially to the conveners for putting such a wonderful panel together. So the topic I'm presenting on today is the digital welfare state and who are the real leaders in the digital welfare state. And the study actually draws on some of my previous work, which is linked with the digitization of social cash programs in developing economies and developing countries, and how the datafication of these programs are linked with financial inclusion. But today we're taking a different perspective, and we're looking at the role of different socio-technical and economic actors which are involved in the digital welfare state, and how are some of the datafication issues linking to data governance. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand what we mean by the digital welfare state. Nowadays, many governments around the world are increasingly facing pressures to transform the very nature of how social protection is being provided to the most poor and vulnerable citizens in societies. And we see that a lot of technologies such as artificial intelligence, data analytics are being used to automate, predict, and monitor poorer populations and vulnerable populations. And this particularly becomes very interesting in the context of social cash programs, which are increasingly using biometrics to not only target their potential populations and making populations more visible to the state, but also introducing new modes of providing digital welfare grants to populations. And this is giving rise to the digital welfare state, which is, and especially nowadays, it's becoming a very relevant topic, given the COVID-19 pandemic, where governments are facing increasing pressure to provide social protection to the most vulnerable populations who are being affected by the lockdown. Next slide, please. So many social cash programs around the world are being datafied, and we need to understand what we mean by datafication. And datafication is the use of different ICTs and database technologies to produce data which is machine readable. And this digital data can be tracked, it can be collected, and it can be analyzed. And not only that, we find that increasingly many corporations are sharing this data with the state, with the private sector, with development agencies. And as a result of this datafication within social cash programs, we find that there are many issues of ethics and governance which are arising, which would be explored later in the end. Next slide, please. So if we look at the literature, most of the literature is based on the information systems literature, where we find that a lot of big tech companies are being unregulated. And recently, last year, there was an article in The Guardian in which the United Nations rapporteur, he mentioned that a lot of big tech companies, they're going unregulated, and they're not being held accountable. And there are lots of human right-free zones where the most vulnerable and the poor people are being punished through the use of technology and through data analytics, which are being used by the digital welfare state to target, surveil, their populations. And not only this, but it has also proved that the use of technology increasingly is creating more exclusion, and it's creating a more divide between the poor and the rich. And biometrics and other technologies which are being used by the digital welfare state are not only, on one hand, although they're providing efficiency in the provision of social protection, but on the other hand, it seems that there's a big misunderstanding with regards that they're not inclusive enough, and they're providing lesser services, lesser holistic services to the most effective and the vulnerable, and to the most affected and vulnerable populations. Next slide, please. So what I'm trying to understand in this study is to find out how datafication of digital social cash programs are creating new opportunities for inclusion or for exclusion. And this study becomes particularly relevant in the COVID-19 crisis, where we're trying to understand who is in control. Is it the government, are the data corporations, or are they citizens? And this issue would be explored through a socio-technical lens. Next slide, please. So the study is based on a case study of the Ehsaas program, which is one of the largest programs in South Asia. And this program has been initiated to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's an extension of the Benazir Income Support Program, which was previously launched many years back in 2008, which is targeting poor women, especially women in poor households, and which is not only contributing towards women empowerment, but also financial and political inclusion. Next slide, please. So just to give a background of the Ehsaas program, we find that it's based on 4 pillars. The first pillar is providing social protection, social grants to poor women and widows, and it's being driven under the BIS program. Then there's another pillar which is providing welfare payments in the form of food scheme, low-cost housing schemes, and health insurance to orphans, disabled, to the sick, and to the elderly. And a third pillar of the program is trying to increase and enhance the livelihoods of the informal sector by providing microcredit and agricultural subsidies. And it's based on various welfare and pension schemes. And the last part of the program is aimed towards increasing and enhancing capabilities of poor students through skills development and through providing digital training and skills. Next slide, please. So if we look at the income support program, which was launched in 2008, initially when the program was launched, targeting was not digitized at all. And we saw that politicians selected a few households which were handpicked. And this was actually done to increase the political patronage in the regional constituencies. And it was found that the program, it was found that the program was not very transparent and visible. And even the delivery of cash was, through cash payments. Politicians were handing out the grants to women in their households, or it was through money orders by postmen. And it was found that the program was, there were lots of bribes which were taken. Women beneficiaries did not receive full payments. Some of the payments were untracked. And there were accountability issues as well, including security issues. And as a result of these shortcomings of the program, there was increasing pressure to digitize the program through the use of certain technologies. Next slide, please. So in 2010, the program was digitalized, and there were various actors which were involved. And if we look at the ecosystem of the digital welfare state, we find that the main political actor is, of course, the government. Then we have a few techno-economic actors, which are public corporations, as well as private companies, which include banks and banking agents. And the social actors are the recipients of the social grants, which are, of course, the beneficiaries in this case. Next slide, please. So we'll be looking at each of these actors one by one and examining their role in the digital welfare state. And the role of the government is, of course, to provide, to devise a strategy for policy formulation, and it allocates a budget to the social welfare scheme, which is around $900 million. And in 2010, when the program was digitized, political actors were removed, politicians were removed, which were previously involved in the targeting and in the delivery of social cash grants. And it was found that because of the automation of the program, there was greater transparency, efficiency, and of course, a reduction in transaction costs as well, because all these human actors or human intermediaries were removed, and technology was introduced, as intermediaries. And so the role, of course, and the power was diminished within the digital welfare state. Next slide, please. Another role is of the National Database Registration Authority, which is NADRA. And NADRA is an important actor. It's an important technical actor within the digital welfare state in Pakistan. And the role of NADRA is to provide digital identity cards to its citizens. It's providing citizenship. It holds the largest database of biometric data, and approximately there are 96 million citizens who have registered with NADRA and who have been given smart national ID cards. And the role of NADRA is very critical in the running of the social cash program in Pakistan, and it provides a platform on which users and beneficiaries are targeted, and not only targeted and being made eligible beneficiaries for the program, but it's also contributing towards biometric authentication in the program when beneficiaries are receiving their grants. Next slide, please. So in 2010, when the Venezuelan Income Support Program was digitized, we found that the role of NADRA was in datafying the program. The beneficiary populations were made visible. NADRA introduced a poverty scorecard survey, which was based on objective targeting. This was a new tool which was based on a proxy means test, where beneficiaries were identified. And at the end, 27 million households were entered in the National Socioeconomic Registry, which is one of the largest socioeconomic registries, which is a database which is actually holding biometric data of citizens, which are actually the poorest of the poor, and who are eligible to receive welfare. And out of the 27 million households, it was found that 7.7 of the households were poorest of the poor. And what happened was that 6 million beneficiaries started receiving £35 per quarter approximately in the form of social welfare grants, which is not much, but at the same time, it was just enough so that it helped many households to buy medicines, to buy food, and to basically uplift some households from some of the basic levels of poverty. Next slide, please. So the power of data analytics within the digital welfare state, we found that last year there was a big scandal that there were lots of uneligible beneficiaries who were registered onto the program, and around 140,000 BIS beneficiaries were removed. And this, there was a lot of hue and cry in Pakistan over this, and this was as a result that data analytics were used by NADRA, and this helped to actually target eligible beneficiaries, and it removed those beneficiaries who were not eligible to receive social grants from the government. And it was found that many people who were families of BIS officials were receiving grants. So there was a lot of corruption, which was actually brought to the surface through the use of data analytics, which was actually done through NADRA. Next slide, please. So in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see that the Prime Minister of Pakistan, he is facing a lot of challenge, or there's a lot of, the underlying question is how to save livelihoods, where on one hand, there's a health emergency in the country, but on the other hand, out of a total population of 220 million, we find that 25% of the population in Pakistan is is severely poor. And so what happened was during this pandemic was that 4.8 million households were actually added on to the existing 7.7 million households who were previously receiving social grants from the government. And the total number of families which were covered, at the time of the crisis, and even currently now, is around 12 million families who are receiving approximately £60, which is a one-time lump sum payment. And I think because of the coronavirus situation in Pakistan, where the number of cases are increasingly on the rise these days, I think that the government in Pakistan is facing even more pressure to increase the budget for this program in order to sustain more people onto this program, because there's a lot of uncertainty as to when the crisis will be ending. And although the government has changed its strategy nowadays, and it's moving towards a more smarter lockdown, which is targeting very localized areas of populations which are showing higher numbers of cases. However, this does not really imply that it's deterring a lot of people from leaving their houses and earning their livelihoods. Next slide, please. So within the background of the COVID-19 pandemic, beneficiaries or the existing citizens were asked to text their ID number. Again, this was the number which was granted to them by NADRA, the national ID card, to text their ID number to a special call line. And their national ID number was received by NADRA. NADRA ran a few data analytics, and it checked whether those citizens were actually eligible to receive grants from the government, because first what happened was that only the poorest of the poor families were receiving grants. But in the light of this crisis, a lot of informal workers, daily wage earners were being affected. They weren't allowed to leave their houses, of course, because of the lockdown situation in the country. And in order to enroll them onto the program, NADRA actually, or the Ehsaas program, started extending its its capacity or its provision of granting social welfare to another tier of population, which was not which was being excluded first, but again, this was being affected by the pandemic, and it included the more informal workers. And NADRA actually ran a set of data analytics which ensured that those people who wanted to register onto the program had no travel history, did not own a bank account, they were not government employees, and they also had not, they had not applied for any other grants through any other corporations or through any other government programs in the past. And those beneficiaries or citizens, they were finally, they received a text in order to make them eligible to receive the grant from the government. Next slide, please. So we've looked at the role of the technical actors in the digital welfare state, and now we'll move on and we'll look at the role of other economic actors, which are, of course, banks, which are involved, which are providing electronic accounts to citizens. And these are not actual full bank accounts, but they're limited purpose bank accounts, which are being used as withdrawal accounts only, where women and citizens can only withdraw the social grants through biometric enabled ATMs, or NADRA have provided biometric readers to banking agents, to various retailers across the country, where fingerprints are authenticated against the NADRA database. However, all this was set up under the COVID-19 crisis in haste, and in order to rapidly deploy and extend this social safety net to a wider population in Pakistan. But I think the underlying question was that technology such as mobile money was underutilized. It was not utilized, which was previously done under the regular BIS program, where women were provided grants through mobile financial services. But however, this program this emergency digital cash grants, which was actually rolled out, during the pandemic, I think there was a lot of planning was not possible, because I think the focus was to quickly and rapidly disperse grants to cover the poorer and vulnerable segments of the society as soon as they could. Next slide, please. So when we look from the beneficiaries' perspective, they are the social actors. And we find that, by receiving social grants before the pandemic, it contributed towards social inclusion. There was a lot of women beneficiaries because besides the Ehsaas emergency cash program, which was rolled out during the COVID-19 crisis, the main objective of the social cash program in Pakistan was to empower women, and a lot of women felt empowered, and it also granted state citizenship, and which contributed towards political inclusion in Pakistan, because having a national ID also meant that a lot of women in Pakistan were allowed to vote for the very first time. And they were also given access to bank accounts, which contributed towards limited financial inclusion, because these were only bank accounts through which funds could be withdrawn, but they could not deposit any savings. However, there were other challenges where it was found out that there was digital and financial literacy was lacking. And under the lockdown, women were not able to go on public transport to receive their grants, and a lot of them felt victim, where, of course, it was not a very secure system of receiving payments in cash form. Next slide, please. So some of the socio-technical challenges are that of the digital welfare state, especially in the light of the COVID-19 crisis, is that, because of the context behind which the program was rolled out, a lot of banking agents were closed. Women, when they went to the banking agents, of course, they were closed because of the lockdown, and some of the bank staff were also working from home. So if they were having problems of withdrawing some of their grants from biometric-enabled ATMs, they didn't get any assistance. And in some of the retail outlets, there was less cash available, liquidity issues were happening. And since they had to provide the thumb impressions, there were connectivity issues as well. And of course, in certain areas in Pakistan, there were power cuts, and so their payments could not be authenticated against NADRA's database. Next slide, please. So coming to the discussion, we find that in the context of the digital welfare state, we find that the technical actors, which are NADRA, they are the real leaders. And this because there was a big technology, because of the fact that women or citizens of the state, daily wage earners or informal workers, were able to use their mobile phones to text and inform the state that they required welfare. So this demand was coming from beneficiaries and citizens of the state. So it was rather not, so it was actually a bottom-up approach, which was used through the datafication of the state welfare program in Pakistan. However, it was found that technology, there was a big drive to make sure that the program was very efficient, and this compromised over some of the solutions for providing mobile money disbursements through mobile banking, where mobile money could have used. Otherwise, mobile banking is very popular in Pakistan, and if mobile banking had been adopted, it would have maybe decreased some of the challenges for women. So although we find that the technical actors, which was NADRA, is actually, it seems to be the real leader in the digital welfare state. However, it's imposing new problems around data regulation and privacy in Pakistan. NADRA holds a very huge database of citizens, and we find that a lot of this data, which is being held by NADRA, by this database, it's being shared by banks, it's being shared by other actors, by private corporations. And in the absence of any data regulatory laws in Pakistan, we find that it's imposing new problems which are linked with data governance, which is also affecting citizen and state relationships. So although we find that the real leaders are technology, because targeting and NADRA is actually surveilling populations, it's making populations visible, but at the other hand, we find that other issues in relation to human rights are being overlooked or are being discounted to some extent. Next slide, please. So we find that, so in order to conclude this presentation, we find that socio-technical approaches, they need to be based on a regulatory framework of principles under which the digital welfare state operates. And it has to be linked with applicable human rights standards. And this definitely gives rise to the data justice discourse, where on one hand, we find that data of citizens is being collected, and it's being used for many purposeful purposes, especially in the context of social cash programs in Pakistan. But then the burning issue is, who is in control of this data? Is it being used properly? Is it being shared properly? Is it fair? And while there has been an overemphasis on technology, there needs to be a shift towards more citizen-centric approaches within the digital welfare state. And this probably means that rather than having a technological deterministic approach where you think that datafication and technology would be solving all the problems of the digital welfare state, although it has many advantages, there are other socio and managerial issues which need to be looked, which are mainly linked with the socio-cultural context and within the context of providing social justice, and in terms of data justice as well, to empower citizens as the main leaders within the context of the digital welfare state. Next slide, please. So here's a list of references. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We have one question here. Asking about, let's see, shall I publish it? There we go. Can you tell us more about the kinds of data shared by the government? Are there any principles violated? What are the risks you see in the data sharing?
So this is a very important question, and this is a question which is it's the next stage of my research, where I'm looking at data governance laws, data regulatory laws in Pakistan. And we find that while NADRA is collecting biometric data of its citizens and it's making populations visible in order for the state to deliver social protection and in order for the state to deliver other services, we find that this is biometric data which is shared it's shared with the public sector. So it's shared with banks, it's shared with the Federal Board of Revenue, citizens' biometric data, and this data is shared with the Federal Board of Revenue in order to increase the tax net of the country, and it's shared by mobile operator companies. As far as violation is, so it's shared with third parties. It's shared by and all this data is shared with the private sector. So of course there are risks in this, but at this stage, I think data, data is, the state. So there are a couple of human right activists who are working on digital data laws in Pakistan, and they're also, and I think the first draft of data law principles have been gone into the assembly, into the parliament, but they haven't been approved. So I think it's at a very immature stage as yet, and there's a lot of work which needs to be done, and to make people more aware that the data by the state is being shared by other private actors. But again, it's linked. What the narrative from the government is that it's for your safety, because of the fact that in the past there has been some incidences of terrorism, and so of course it's linked with security of citizens. And so I think that's how they so I think it's one of the excuses which the government is using, that in order to ensure citizen safety, we are sharing this data. And this data is also being shared by intelligence agencies in Pakistan. And so, of course, there's a lot of work which needs to be done with regards to digital data laws and governance. And it's at a very immature stage in Pakistan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that raises so many issues that I think will be good to talk about collectively in a little while. And I'll just be moving on to my talk as the second one, which will discuss some of the similar issues from the India side. So thank you very much. I'll just stop your broadcast now, and you can participate in the audience. Okay, so I think I can control my own slides here. All right, thank you, everyone. So I'm Eric Casper. I didn't introduce myself earlier, but I'm a research fellow at IDS. Today I'll be talking about the urban data governance landscape from the perspective of a research project that we're working on in India, looking at the as part of the Smart Cities mission in India. So just to start off, I want to look at the example of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So basically in 2013, a professor at Cambridge University created a Facebook app which was able to reach 300,000 people via Facebook. And from those 300,000 people who used the app, data was generated on 87 million people. So the data was collected legally within Facebook terms of service. However, at some point, he then sold that data on to a company, Cambridge Analytica, or the company who owned Cambridge Analytica, which did break Facebook terms of service, but was not illegal in any way. What's interesting about this is that when it came to light, what Cambridge Analytica had done with the data, namely influencing elections and targeting and sowing discord, people came to feel that this was a breach of something, whether it was a breach of data protocol or a breach of trust. Facebook has faced tremendous backlash from authorities and users. So what does this incident tell us? As the kind of first major instance where there's a popular awareness of data governance concerns, I would say it highlights the fact that we're in a new world where there's an increasing potential to use and misuse data in surprising ways. And people are concerned sometimes, but they don't have the instincts to properly perceive or react to the threats. So I think this may come up again today, the Cambridge Analytica case, but what I want to delve into is what kind of incentives those actors who use data and govern data have to treat the data according to principles. So one potential question is, what happens if cities or governments start to behave like Facebook or behave like Cambridge Analytica? So I'll be speaking about this project that we've been involved in. A number of us, including Asif, Jaideep, who's in the audience. We have funding from the European Union. Our partners are the National Institute of Urban Affairs. It's a 3-year project. We're going into the second half of our 3rd year now. And we've been working closely with 4 cities from the Indian Smart Cities mission to address issues of inclusiveness in the cities. So we recognize that there's a tendency among smart cities, amongst those who talk about smartness in cities, to emphasize the technology and not necessarily the inclusiveness. And we wanted to turn the big data for smart cities paradigm on its head and say, is there a way we can be smarter about how we use data specifically to address inclusiveness concerns in cities? So the Smart Cities mission emphasizes inclusiveness to some extent. Each of the 4 cities that we've chosen to work with has, in their own smart city proposal, laid out some aspirations to make their cities not just smarter, but more inclusive. So we're working with Kochi in the south of India in Kerala state, Bhopal and Jabalpur in Madhya Pradesh, and Faridabad, which is a city just outside of Delhi. So inclusiveness in the Smart Cities mission has mostly been limited to, in terms of the projects, has been limited to the planning phases of projects and the idea that a project should impact, say, the inclusiveness of services such as transport or sanitation. So it should, allow more citizens to access a service or something. But we observed that the mission was requiring a massive effort to build a data system, basically from the ground up, and these would either be exclusive by design or inclusive by design. So we found ourselves at this really interesting moment where a data system was being designed from the ground up. And we felt like this is a very interesting place to intervene as a project. So we began to shift our focus from data for more inclusive services to what does it mean to build an inclusive data system? And about 8 months into our project, the UN Inclusiveness Data Charter was released, which sort of encapsulates an idea of what an inclusive data system would be, which is that all populations must be included in the data. Data should be disaggregated to accurately describe all populations. It should be drawn from all available sources. Those responsible for the collection of data and production of statistics must be accountable, and human and technical capacity to collect, analyze, and use data must be improved. So our project is working on that last point, trying to improve capacity to deal with data. The idea that those responsible for collection of data and production of statistics must be accountable is interesting because it assumes that there are some principles to which we can all agree people must be held accountable. And I think, as was raised in the first talk, that's not actually true at this point. There isn't a consensus about these things, and there certainly isn't a set of laws or policies that clearly guide these things. But it is still something to which we can aspire. So in the 4 cities that we were working with in India, we noticed that there's this rush to what's called to build integrated command and control centers, which would focus on bringing together data streams from different departments or different services into one centralized center, and taking a very technocratic or technical approach to these things, where the management of those data streams would be outsourced to consulting firms who come in to do the technical work of implementing systems. And we noticed that there are weak, unclear, or non-existent policies, laws, and regulations about how that data should be governed. So in one of our cities, Bhopal, we were there for the inauguration of their integrated command and control center. So you see we have a very pristine, high-tech looking display on a screen, and a set of workstations with office chairs where people can sit and watch data coming in live from various things. So on the right side there, we have the display for their smart pole project, which is one of several projects that was meant to generate sensor data or integrate real-time data on services. So things like real-time weather reports, lighting, CCTV cameras, which would be able to monitor traffic, air quality, and that kind of thing. So what we did from a research method point of view is we worked with these teams who were involved in the cities to trace out the processes of their various projects. So like the Smart Pole project, for example. So we had discussions, we mapped out the different stakeholders, the connections between them, the contracting issues, the process issues, who answers to whom, what objectives, where does the technology fit in, where does it fit in with the institutional context. Sorry, 1 second. Right. So this method produced a bit of data, a bit of understanding about the architecture of this emerging data system. So we noticed that, again, it's a very technical, technocratic approach to data, driven by the need to implement a project, not directly addressing the need to design an inclusive data system. So yes, next slide. So this process tracing revealed how the system, how the projects were integrating into this emerging data system, and it demonstrated the connections to these consulting firms and this emerging complex system of actors, and it demonstrated the need for capacities and innovation grounded in principles. Basically, in each of these integrated command and control centers, we see the attempt to bring together just everything available. If you can collect the data, bring it to us. Different services, let's integrate them into the command and control center with little deep thought about how are you going to do that institutionally? How are you going to govern that? What limits do you place on yourself as this governing body in terms of what you can do with the data? Okay, so this is what we were doing in the project, and I want to just provide this landscape of the urban data governance structures that we've encountered. So at the highest level, you have general data regulations, which, even though it's a European thing, the GDPR definitely structures what's going on all around the world. India has its own bill, the Data Protection Bill, which, as far as I know, is still a draft legislation being discussed and explored, which is sort of attempting to do a similar thing as the GDPR. But then established, we have the Aadhaar system, which is the Indian equivalent to what was mentioned in the first talk, a biometric ID, a digital ID system for all Indian citizens. The India stack, which is built on top of that as a sort of meta data system to leverage the information from the national ID. And then what I want to dig into and illuminate here is the structures for urban data that have come out through the Smart Cities mission. Okay, so just to look at the Aadhaar system, it is a national biometric ID, which is designed to, limit leakages, I guess, or to verify people's right to access services and exclude those who don't have a right to access services. So the Aadhaar provides one layer, which can be seen there as the presence-less layer. There's also the idea that you would use this data system to allow people to make payments, to allow individuals' records to move across systems, and to this consent layer, which allows data to move freely and securely to democratize the market for data. So what's interesting there is that we're talking about a market for data inherent in the very structure of the national ID and the India stack. So on top of that, the Smart Cities mission has resulted in another layer of the stack, which is focused on cities and urban data. So the National Urban Innovation Stack, which is really sort of a national urban data stack. So you can see that it's built on top of the India stack. It's about integrating core services, physical infrastructure, data systems, databases, and urban solutions platforms. The urban innovation stack is also, I mean, it's designed for each of the cities to integrate their own data systems into a sort of integrated national urban data architecture. If we look at the guidance for the urban innovation stack, I don't know if you can see clearly in the slide there. I thought it might be a bit bigger, but anyway, one of the aspects is access to data. So it assumes a sea of data which can be studied for the benefit of the ecosystem. Then access to clients. So it says innovators can find clientele. They can be more targeted in their approaches and can receive almost automatic feedback from the ecosystem. So what we see is the urban innovation stack it builds on systems and processes that are currently being contested and have been shown to be somewhat insecure. And amid the technocratic jargon, there's a clear aspiration to collect and monetize data by creating a marketplace. So there's the idea that private and even public sector firms will want this data to find better clients and target them. And it's exactly the same kind of surveillance capitalism model and issues that we could see in the Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica example. So some of the insights here are that cities in India face incentives similar to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Urban and national data systems are emerging. And we can see that those data systems are being shaped by the forces at play here, which will either be narrow technocratic business interests or principles of inclusiveness driven by an engaged public. Okay, I want to, 1 second. Okay, cool. I'll try to wrap up quickly here. But so our project has been, working with some of the smart cities in the Smart Cities mission. And our partner is the National Institute of Urban Affairs, which is a think tank affiliated with the Ministry of Urban Affairs. And so we've been able to feed some of our insights into the ongoing development of the Smart Cities mission process. And in part, I think you can see our voice as one of many voices that are represented in some of the guidance that's come out more recently from the mission, including these two really interesting documents, Data Smart Cities Strategy and the Data Maturity Assessment Framework. The key thing about the Data Smart City strategy is that it mandates a city-level data policy. It requires each of the 100 smart cities in the mission to articulate their own policy about data and data governance at the level of the city, and it mandates a city-level data alliance, which is thought to, well, it's described as, an alliance of various stakeholders from civil society, from basic everyday citizens to business interests and the like. So in a way, it's trying to be more deliberate and intentional about how this data system is emerging, how it's constructed, and is trying to nurture this public discussion where principles and guidance can be generated. So there it describes the elements of the city data policy. And what's interesting is that it describes them in the abstract, but it's very, very hard to provide useful direct guidance to cities, a kind of template beyond an overly simplified template of what needs to be done. Basically, we're at the stage where cities have to innovate and have to create policies from scratch to really achieve what's needed in their city. In the language of this document, it talks about the data alliance, so a collaborative framework to create and define use cases to solve critical city problems through the use of data, catalyze collaborations, to build networks, to make data available, and undertake a continuous dialogue between the stakeholders around the policy. So the idea is that these data alliances should shape the policy. Okay. And then the data maturity framework basically provides a framework for assessing the data systems as they emerge. It considers what they call systemic maturity. So basically, are the systems, the data systems in place, and are they mature? And the sectoral maturity, which is about, is the data being used well? Is it being used in interesting ways to actually achieve something? And the data maturity framework, it's broken down into 5 sections, 5 key elements. So one of the key elements is the policy. So does the city data policy exist? And does it address the key data governance issues? And you can also see there the process is one of the things. And an element of the process is the city data alliance. So the city is assessed on whether it has formed a data alliance, although that's a relatively small aspect of the whole process, the data system process element, which the city has to create as well. So these are the key elements of data governance framework, or the data governance landscape for urban data in India. And our project has been working with these cities to understand the guidance that's coming out of these documents and to innovate, to understand areas where capacity needs to be strengthened so that the emerging data system can be effective and also more inclusive. So we've sort of structured the guidance around the technical side of things. And I believe Asif will be talking a bit more about the technical aspects, so using technology to drive more inclusive data systems, and the public engagement side, which is really the data alliances, right? So the data alliances are mandated, but we see that the accountability for forming those data alliances is only one small element of how cities are assessed. And so what we can do is really nurture that space and bring people together to identify leaders and to work with cities who are actually genuinely interested in generating that public input. And so we facilitated some discussions about opportunities and risks of data governance. So again, we find that while there's interest and while these data systems are evolving in really interesting ways, neither citizens nor authorities appear to have this deep understanding or intuition about the risks of data governance. So even though we've seen things like abuse of surveillance data in Hong Kong, even though we've seen things like abuse of user data with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, people tend to not really have the kind of intuition about what could go wrong in cities and urban data systems as they're evolving. We noticed through our workshops that different stakeholders have different experiences, biases. So one thing I've noticed is that, for example, official statistics and official statistics offices tend to think about data in one way, whereas the authorities tend to think about sort of spatial data and open data, which have their own unique history of wrestling with data governance challenges, whereas cities are now this melting pot of, service data, open data, public space data, spatial data, survey and demographic data about citizens in the cities, but also this new sensor data that's coming from kind of smart city things. So it's a really interesting confluence of things which needs to be integrated. So I'm going to skip that. Okay, so just to conclude, the urban data governance landscape is sort of weak and haphazard, but it is emerging quickly. The rapid developments in India have created the opportunities, but also the necessity for technological and institutional innovations to make these data systems work well. Active leadership from engaged citizens to help counter the incentives for exclusion and authoritarianism, which are made possible by the data changes and the technological changes, as well as active leadership from urban authorities genuinely looking to build more inclusive cities. And finally, it's clear that building inclusive data systems and inclusive data governance in cities and everywhere requires substantial values-driven principles to articulate, the kind of data governance we want, but also set reasonable limits on what actors can do. But we have to go beyond just general principles. We have to experiment and innovate collectively at that intersection between the technology and the institution, recognizing that we just don't quite have the appropriate intuitions yet. So I'll wrap it up there and hopefully build on that discussion later. Any questions for this? No questions. Okay, excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Who is next? I believe Amrita is next, right? Okay, feel free to add anything in the chat while we upload the new or load the next file. Okay, over to you then.
Good, great. So just checking, I need to let you know for the slide changes, right? Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much, Eric, for putting this panel together and for this opportunity. So today I want to kind of present these a couple of set of ideas. Really, this is really preliminary and kind of has come out from a lot of discussions with Eric and other colleagues, and where we want to understand the intersections between trade and trade policies and the ideas on data regulations and data governance, some of what Eric has been talking about. So, the topic is understanding intersections of trade and data governance, and we want to examine specifically the case of India. Again, disclaimer, work in progress, a really preliminary set of ideas, but we thought it would be useful to have this discussion today to get feedback, but also have really start this set of conversations on the topic. And just to say, this is in collaboration with Eric, as well as another colleague, Marco Carreras, at the Institute of Development Studies. Now, digital trade, what we understand from digital trade, and there's a growing consensus that this idea of digital trade includes all sorts of digitally enabled transactions of trade in goods as well as services, but those that can be either digitally or physically delivered, or a combination of that. And that involves usually consumers, firms, and governments. And with that different aspects that underlie this this exchange of either goods or services or data, the intersections between these cross-border flows and how those flows are regulated becomes important. So hence in our existing research, we've dealing with different aspects of this topic. We want to take that further and really focus on the intersections between trade and how data is governed, and how that landscape is really emerging, and how there are differences across how different countries and governments are responding, and then kind of apply this developing set of ideas to examine the case of India. So if I can start, Eric, next slide, please. So the objectives really with that background is to sort of really focus on these specific intersections and see how specific sorts of trade law, and when I say trade law, of course, there's multilateral trade law, which is governed by the World Trade Organization, but also a lot of emerging and developing aspects of trade law and preferential trade agreements, how these are reacting to the increasing importance of how data flows function, and what are the implications for India. Now, when we think about data flows and digital services delivery in particular, and how that happens across borders, of course, it would be fair to say that these are playing a particularly important role in our response to the current pandemic. But digital trade and services is also among the most dynamic sectors in the global economy, and there's certainly scope for harnessing them further for supporting a sort of recovery from the pandemic, or hopefully being optimistic, the post crisis phase. And emerging technologies such as blockchain, artificial intelligence, or really the internet and the scope that it offers could certainly, and is in fact really altering the trade landscape and how trade has been governed in recent years, and will be governing this landscape also in the years to come. So kind of with that background, we want to ask these questions about how the governance of the internet, data governance, and international trade together have these deep implications for the development of a more secure and a more inclusive digital economy. I think some of what Eric has already talked about, but really addressing very directly some of these intersections and how those are reacting to the current situation. So the motivation in the next slide, Eric. Thank you. So the motivation is really that a lot of literature in the last couple of years or so has been addressing this relationship that exists between internet, data, as well as international trade. It is also true that there are a lot of known as well as unknown barriers to digital trade that exist, and in some cases, knowingly or unknowingly, these are even growing. Unknowingly, when there are some outdated rules or new forms of protectionism or as simply domestic on the domestic front, policymakers try to address some very new governance questions, and especially when there is no, there's not enough or not adequate international collaboration. That kind of creates this sort of tension between what's at the national level and what's globally developing, with or without within the purview of the WTO. E-commerce, when we talk about e-commerce, entrepreneurs in this sector must navigate challenges, in terms of delivery, in terms of logistics, cross-border payments, and this also becomes really kind of embedded in this conversation about internet and international trade. While all of this is happening on the international trade front, what is emerging increasingly is this conversation or narrative about data localization. And a lot of governments are discovering that there are various hurdles, and as well as kind of issues emerging from the perspective of international digital services supply. There is a promise, of course, that trade technologies can increase efficiency and inclusiveness, but that is being challenged. Why? Because technology, of course, creates disruptive effects on business, and these challenges need to be navigated, and there are questions around how these global digital activities are taxed, how these kind of digital collaborations are made. But with increasingly available digital trade data, the relationship between data governance and data flows is also being incorporated in trade agreements. So a lot of preferential trade agreements, I say a lot, but about 5 or 6 of them have explicitly included these data governance and data exchange mechanisms. But it is interesting that the focus of the debate on these questions has mainly been on the regulatory environment. And while this is happening and emerging kind of globally, the debate on many, on these questions in many, especially lower income countries, has been on, has still been at the margins, because fairly so, because there's a lot of unknown when we think about digital trade and the barriers to digital trade. But there is also a conflict between what are more or less globally accepted mechanisms versus what is known so far in data localization, and how to deal with that. So with that motivation, and with that background, what we want to in going forward and picking these ideas further, what we want to do as next steps, and that's on my next slide. What we want to do is really a structured review of the literature to kind of see what are the key aspects of this conversation. So just to say, this is really a conceptual paper that we are trying to put together, and then focus on that case study for India. And in doing so, we want to focus on kind of two areas as inclusion criteria in our review of the literature. In talking about this, new data-driven economy, and the underlying ideas, I think Eric, as well as the previous presentations, have talked about. But with this new idea that there's a new data-driven economy, data is often seen, or it is in fact seen, as a commodity or as a form of capital. But with some of what I've said already, there are huge concerns about data sovereignty, as well as how data localization can be dealt with at the domestic level. So that's kind of our first driving question or driving area that we want to address with our review. And then kind of take that to the interface between international trade law and how this data governance is visible in a few key areas, these being regulation of cross-border flows of data. So these are national regulations, cybersecurity, privacy and data protection, online consumer protection, protection of online intellectual property rights, and net neutrality. These are the areas that we find in our preliminary review so far. But with those two different dimensions, we want to kind of go and really structurally look for the underlying themes that can then help us kind of complete our focus on analyzing this for India. So just a little more about how we are going forward with the review of the literature so far. On my next slide. Sorry, Eric, next slide. So I'm going to keep it short because I know we are pressed for time, and then the chairs have already communicated that I am pressed for time. So I'll try to summarize rather than go in depth on various questions. So in terms of the review, a little bit more that we are looking at three levels. So we are looking at more generally looking at issues related to legislative competence and data protection. But linking that with what we know globally at the international level in terms of role of the WTO and how that is being navigated in regulating trade through legal principles, and linking that with what's happening at the domestic level, where there is a need of adaptation of those legal principles and norms at the national level with national regulations. So with those three themes, we are kind of driving this review forward. And that's kind of on my next slide. Yes, so what we have found so far, we wanted to kind of just summarize some of these preliminary findings from this review of the literature that we've looked at. So just summarizing these insights. We find that if when we look at high income countries, of course, the spread of digital services is at the same time accompanied by these legislative transformations and adaptations, and these examples are fairly well known and have been talked about already. So in EU there is the General Data Protection Regulation, which with the underlying idea that data is a fundamental right of the individual, and when it comes to trade agreements specifically, any kind of privacy is excluded from trade agreements. In fact, it's dealt with under a separate clause, which is called an adequacy agreement. So there is, a trade kind of link with even this EU, the GDPR as we know it. And, I think researchers in the UK as well as the EU are affected by it. But, also globally, as it says, is an example of understanding. But, kind of in comparison to that, there is data recognition in the US as a form of capital, which is often used to kind of for profit and kind of is sort of when we compare it with the EU General Data Protection Regulation is sort of quite different. And even in low-income countries, when we look at the extent to which they are integrated with this globally accepted paradigms of data protection and integration in the international market, they are integrated. There is some reaction in terms of national regulation. However, I think the main constraint that we find is that the experience with digital trade itself is low. So that kind of acts as an sort of as a challenge when trying to respond to some of these data governance questions as such. And in fact, to present some facts, next slide will help me give some numbers on some of these I think quite well known findings. So we see that in terms of facts, or if I can say in terms of national data strategies, which kind of helps kind of give some context to what I was saying, we see that countries with national data plans are very few. Most countries have data protection laws. So you'll see in this figure about 107 countries have data protection laws. Most countries, or a lot of countries, also have open data plans or commitments. But again, very few countries with formal AI strategies, as well as very few are actually responding to AI strategies and kind of coming up with any of our strategies for AI. So the status of national data strategies, which link in with trade agreements, are very different across countries. Their responses are different. While the more well-known kind of data protection laws as well as open data plans are more popular in countries' responses, understanding around AI and these new data forms is still really emerging. So taking that kind of further and talking a bit more about trade on my next slide. So kind of digital and digitally enabled trade, as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, is certainly dependent on the access of internet and the free flow of data across boundaries. But these data are not, at least the recognition that there is data flows underlining these digital forms of trade is developing. And when we look at international trade agreements, something I mentioned earlier, for the first time in history, has included provisions specifically on digital trade and addressing cross-border data flow, as well as privacy issues. And we see that in for example, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership. We saw that in the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, as well as the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement and the EU-Japan EPA. So these are just examples of the few trade agreements that have kind of incorporated what we are witnessing in terms of data governance and data laws. So, and when we further kind of in this review, which kind of shows us that how countries are responding, I think there are about 6 areas which are getting clearer in relation to trade. And on my next slide, just summarizing, how these rules are being understood, and this is kind of work done by Aronson. We see that there are these 6 areas. So there are binding trade agreements which kind of govern cross-border data flows, but these are few. So like I gave you 5 examples of trade agreements. There are open data plans, which just emerging, very few countries. I showed some statistics. There are data protection laws. Lots of countries have tabled these data protection laws, as Eric gave the example of India, and I'll summarize in my next slide. These are in countries' responses. There are, of course, the Industry 4, the Industrial Revolution 4 plans, and these are really, really nascent at the moment, along with any kind of artificial intelligence or big data plans. So in our review, we come across these different areas of rules that are governing cross-border data from perspective of trade. And with those kind of factors, we look at the case of India and try to see what has been happening in the last couple of years, especially from in the last 2 decades. And I'd like to summarize what has, we are still fairly early in our examination of what's happening in India and really understanding the different rules and regulations, especially given the overlap that exists. But this, just on my slide, you'll see that there is a timeline that you can see in terms of various data regulation, active and proposed measures, which link in with some of the digital trade aspects that I was talking about. Just going way back to 1993 with the Public Records Act, coming more recently to 2019 with the Personal Data Protection Bill. Within that period, there have been great strides in improving access to the internet. However, what has not happened in India at the moment so far, and we are still, I think, struggling a little bit, is the quality of the internet access. So there are lots of, for example, internet, power outage, which affects, the internet access quite a lot. And we are still kind of struggling with that challenge. However, there has been some progress, and some of what Eric has already talked about in relation to his smart cities work. In 2012, for example, the government launched the National Optical Fiber Network project, which was a great step forward, from a social dimension, because it linked in the Gram Panchayats with the specifically with kind of central internet points. Now, it is also, I think, in this review of looking at these different regulations over time, and I won't be going into the details, is that India's approach to regulate personal data has been fairly distinct from the approaches of China, EU, or the US through this draft personal data protection bill. It has promised the wider outreach to the to various social in terms of being access to different socioeconomic groups, but of course it is still it is still tabled, and it hasn't kind of passed as of now. I think it remains to be seen how sort of the proposed measures together help respond or kind of define a new approach in this regulation of personal data. At the same time, just thinking about the trade perspective in relation to the personal data protection plan on my next slide, I'd like to kind of outline some very optimistic predictions that have been made for India. And of course, they hold true given the scope of digital trade in India's domestic economy. We see that digital trade enables a very sizable chunk of economic impact within the domestic economy, and predictions suggest that by 2030, this potential is going to become multifold. It's going to multiply quite rapidly, and the sectors agriculture, infrastructure, and retail are the ones that kind of hold the most value. In terms of India's exports, the predictions are similar, that by 2013, India's digital exports could grow by more than 200%, which is really optimistic. But it also brings to light, that there are ongoing negotiations, there's ongoing dialogue on how India's approach on personal data protection is going to affect all of these figures. And I'd like to kind of summarize what we have so far on India, and how that's coming together on my next slide. So with the data protection laws and the data governance laws, and looking at the optimistic scenario for trade, it is still fair to say there is currently no sort of overarching data protection legislation. There are sector-specific regulations, and of course, the data protection, personal data protection bill has been tabled. We also see that data centers have really proliferated in some states, and for example, in Telangana, in Maharashtra, in these states, we've seen that there are data centers, local data centers. However, the cost of kind of localization has been assessed as really significant. So if the cross-border data flow projections that I showed you were kind of actually the estimates on the other hand of this conversation suggest that these could kind of if the cross-border data flows were to decline, the impact on India's total trade could also be really huge. So while there are optimistic projections in terms of trade and cross-border data flows, at the same time, these questions about localization and the cost of localization of that data are estimated as really high for the Indian context. So I think that's pretty much where we are at the moment in our preliminary research on the topic. But in the interest of time, I'd like to summarize. There are emerging issues when we talk about these intersection between data governance and trade, extremely challenging, extremely complicated, and really evolving fairly dynamically. But I think the most critical points, and these are our entry points in this piece of research, is that there is localization and localization costs versus what is often in the narrative as a globally coordinated kind of security measure or a set of measures that are going to come. For India, policy overlaps with the sector localization measures need to be kind of thought through really carefully. But if we talk about, in terms of the way forward, and also this will drive some of what we do next, is that there are these three pillars, which is about protecting privacy of citizens and the local tax base. So, that links a little bit to personal data protection. But at the same time, there is, of course, need for these enabling rapid access to data as well. So that needs kind of, thinking a lot more about how, of course, there's law enforcement and adherence to regulations, but also safeguarding national security, which raises questions about data sovereignty. And finally, how to support the growth of, domestic digital firms, startups, which can, be more inclusive of local jobs. So kind of connecting the domestic or the local with the global kind of is really the challenge when we think about these interactions between trade and data governance. And I think with that, I'll rest my case so that I'm respectful of what the panel has told me. Those are just a few references that have come up so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amrita. Let me just see if we have any clarification questions here. Or see, Martin has asked, can Indian digital service companies compete in a global marketplace that tends to monopoly? Can we see data localization requirements as a form of protectionism in that context? Do you want to address that quickly, or shall we?
Yeah. So I think these are the questions really we're asking ourselves as we go through this research as well. Can Indian digital service companies compete in the global marketplace? They can, but of course, as you rightly pointed out, there is the challenge about the data localization costs. I think there needs to be a really careful assessment in terms of the extent to which data localization becomes a challenge versus the need for data sovereignty. And going ahead, I think for actually Indian firms to compete globally, this will need to be carefully assessed in light of existing rules and regulations. I don't know if that answers the question, because I think we're faced with the same challenge, but that's what our thought is so far. Thank you.
Yeah.
Martin.
Great, excellent. Thanks so much. Just the broadcast. Okay, so thanks everyone. So as you know, or may have noticed, we have reached the end of the time for the first block. So we had 4 talks scheduled for this block and 3 for the next block. But I've spoken to Asif, and he's happy to start the second block instead of going now. So I would say, since we're out of time for this block, let's end it here and reconvene 2 p.m. for the next block. And Asif will start us off, and we'll be very, very diligent on the timings, start exactly on time, and have time for our discussion at the end. There. So with that, thank you all for coming to this session, and hope to see you all at the next session in a couple of hours.
Hi everyone. So this is kind of an addition, or is an part of the project which Eric actually discussed in the first half. It's a capacity building for smart data and inclusive cities project. So in that, we actually tried to look at different processes, urban processes, in terms of data, and how interdependencies are there in and across different silos in context of smart cities and the projects they have been doing. So this is a collaborative project with IDS and National Institute of Urban Affairs. The project is supported by the European Union. Next slide, please. So I am Mohammad Asif Raza, a research associate at National Institute of Urban Affairs. So it's kind of an collaborative and group effort from the SDIC team. So Eric Casper, Jaideep Gupte from IDS, Priyanka Mehra, Dr. Debjani Ghosh, and Sarat Babu. Three of us are from National Institute of Urban Affairs in India. In this paper, we actually are trying, we map urban systems, different institutional structures and data processes in cities to reveal various interdependencies, to understand where exactly are the nodes where there is a need of interventions, because these are the nodes are actually the nodes are actually the ones where most of this positive and negative aspect of any processes or the outcome of the process depends. So we try to intervene or try to look at those specific nodes. And of course, the project is funded by European Union, which is kind of a 3-year project. So Bhopal and Jabalpur from Madhya Pradesh, and Kochi in Kerala, and Faridabad is another city. We have 4 cities we are working on. So just to give in a brief background and methodology, so we see the various kind of data initiative in the cities, and now data is being used to tell different stories, different complex stories at the city level. So one of the biggest challenges in dealing with data is not technological per se, but there are these different administrative and functional silos when we talk about data in urban systems specifically, because there are different stakeholders which are involved in each of these processes, sometimes integrated and sometimes in silos. So we, using this process tracing methodology, we try to understand those institutional structures and interventions. So the process is more like we did a background study, try to understand how these plans are made, how administrative structures are there. Then we went into the city to understand these from these different stakeholders. We have various discussions, a number of discussions with different kind of stakeholders who are responsible for doing those processes. Now, based on those discussions and rough maps, we try to develop a process map of each of these activity happening in the cities, and then again went back to the cities to make clarifications or to understand or to see that the process has been mapped correctly or not. Next slide, please. So just to give you a brief understanding of how exactly the urban processes are and what are the linkages. So in this mapping, we try to understand this RFID tagging, which is being done for collection of solid waste at Jabalpur. So how each of these blocks, different blocks, talk to each other in this diagram, but a lot of time they may or may not talk to in field on the field, which leads with a lot of time which leads to different problems. Maybe a lot of time it leads to different kind of an activities which and assumptions which leads to not functioning of the project itself. Next slide, please. So just to understand just to understand a little bit about how exactly things function at city level in India. So there are these different blocks have different governance structures. So we have in policy and governance, which are of different layers: central government, state government, and urban local bodies. They have their linkages in terms of funds, they have linkages in terms of their functions. Now most of these functions are being done by the city authorities. City authorities are responsible for the health part, for water supply, for buildings and other departments. So there are approximately 13 or 14 different departments or services which are being provided by these departments, which are listed in these activities. So health department is responsible for doing the waste management at the city. Now each of the waste management has itself three different components: collection, transportation, and disposal. Now each of these different activities are contracted out to different contractors, and there are subcontractors linked in. Now if we put in a new smart city mission came in 2015. If you see the yellow box, it came into 2015. Now both funds and functions are coming in from the central and the state government, but the project which are being designed at the smart city have lot of dependency in terms of functional dependency. If you see the right side upper corner in black lines, so and there are operational dependency of the project, which a lot of time is being included and a lot of time is being overlooked when we design these urban development projects. Next slide please. So this is what happened. So the same thing when this project, so the project outcome of the solid waste management was bring in efficiency into the system, to look at, to monitor different aspects. What if the waste is being collected or not, is the waste is being looking how exactly, where exactly the waste is being collected, who are responsible for doing that. But one of the major component or the dependency was on a contractor who is being contracted out by the corporation and not the smart city office. So now these contractors a lot of time agree and disagree to lot of to do that function or to provide that service to and as a result of this, there's quite a lot of investment which goes into developing those projects. And just because we sometime overlook those dependencies or take those dependencies for granted, the project does not, even if it sees the light of the day, it does not function at as it is intended to function at the city level. Next slide please. So to to understand or to simplify some of these complex processes at the city level, we try to intervene in terms of an technological intervention at city level. So we introduce kind of we introduce kind of a pilot using blockchain technology to address some of these aspects. So there is an emergency service which is an ambulance service at a city in Bhopal. So the so if you see the left side of the left side of the screen of the presentation, there is a process which says that the citizen will call 108 center, the ambulance will arrive, the doctor will, it will take him it will reach the location, and then it will transport the person to the hospital. Now this is a simple flow, but in this there are a lot of uh, non-communication. There is lack of communication between various actors which is happening. So we, using the blockchain technology, are trying to integrate certain aspects. So now we try to integrate, if you see the right side of the presentation, we try to integrate 108 call center, the ambulance driver, the ICCC platform, integrated command and control center platform, the integrated transport management ITMS service, and hospital into the blockchain itself, where all of these different stakeholders can exchange mm, data without seamless data, and have an exact information about the person who is being attended. Now doing this, because we try to understand that in the previous part of the presentation, like there are different complexities, there are different layers of governance which happens, mm, which happens now when we try to integrate that, when we deep dive. So there are problems again with contractors. Now, how exactly each of these contractors should manage? Even if the contractor agrees to it, now there are these technological challenges which comes into play. Now they don't have a developed API, or they may not have a platform where they can develop the API. They might be running on a call to call basis only. Now again, when we try to integrate the transport management system which can develop a green corridor at the city level, the regional transport office have its own mandates and a different process of doing things. Now how to integrate that and bring that into ICCC, or bring that into the data exchange platform which is powered by blockchain, so that they can talk to each other. So now we also have to navigate across these different departments to address some of these challenges. Then there is an traffic police which is altogether is a different process at each of these cities. So some of the key issues and lessons we learned from doing some of these processes. So the this sense of ownership is one of the major aspect which needs to be looked at. The officials from these state level agencies or city level authorities lack the ownership of that thing. So either there is lack of ownership or it's sole ownership. So they just cannot share the data, or they just don't own that data. So that needs to be looked at. Now, trust over technology. When we try to integrate some of this blockchain platform, we need to have a lot of series of discussions with different city officials of higher ranks to trust over the technology, because one cannot see what exactly is happening inside the technology. So the development of trust is one of the key aspect which needs to be looked at, and we have seen that in the previous presentations of this panel also. So then there are these ground level challenges. We may or may not talk about data in terms of for integration and other aspects, but we need to train people. We need to build those capacities at the ground level to manage that, to handle that, to execute whatever instructions are being given, to execute the technological part, or to integrate those things in technological part. How they need to understand that these different overlaps, or how or about responsibility, about data privacy and all of this. So we need these capacity building at the city officials, not at the only the higher ranks, but even the people who are actually working on a day-to-day basis, to make them aware of and consequences of a lot of activities they do on a daily basis. Then clear actions to safeguard privacy, because whenever we talk about data, the first and the foremost giant which comes into play is the privacy part. How we can deal with that? What are the nodes where we need to intervene, where exactly how these different city data can be used using so that this privacy and the secrecy of the citizens remain intact. We do not try to even monetize some of those data sets. So we need some kind of a clear action and needs to safeguard those privacy of the individuals. Next slide, please. So major key takeaways. So there is different set of contexts and processes in each of these cities, and the complexity in each of these processes is different. We tried to talk about 2 or 3 processes. Now we actually are trying to now deep dive into how cross sectionally how each of these processes talk to each other. So any technological solutions are enablers. We have learned this quite well, that technology can enable, but we need techno institutional solutions and setups to utilize those solutions. Unless and until we have these kind of an systems in place, the techno institutional structures in place, it is very difficult to even integrate these technologies or include these technologies in urban systems and processes. So there is a need of administrative and structural aspect in data in cities, so that these different administrative silos and functional silos, we need to understand. A lot of people actually see administrative and functional in one context, but they're very different. How exactly they function in each of these cities, one need to look at in quite in detail and derive or include those in project design. So governance of data is one of the key aspects which needs to be there, because people know about data driven governance, so data will drive the governance part, but how do we actually govern that data? How do we actually manage that data? How do we actually look at that data and manage that data, with including having privacy in mind, having a lot of different aspects in mind, and how should we govern that? So there is also a need of use cases and evidences. We actually try to include and do a lot of these different kind of pilot, which can be used as an use cases, which can develop evidences in which city managers can trust in technology, or can have they can develop that technology. And of course, smart city mission has initiated multiple approaches to address these challenges at the city level. Eric talked about a bit, quite a bit in his presentation regarding all of these things. Next slide, please. So thank you so much. It's quite an complex subject to talk about in urban processes. We try to drill down in some of these. We are in process of drilling down more into of these processes, and it's quite a good experience to be here and talk about some of these processes. And we'll be happy to answer some of your questions which you may have on some of our slides.
Thanks, Asif. That was really great.
And yeah,
I don't know if anyone has any pressing questions at the moment. Nobody's raised them ahead of time, and I don't see any raised hands at the moment. So if you don't mind, let's carry on to the next presentation. And I think this would be great to pick up during the discussion time. All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Alia. Over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So thanks everyone for hanging on there. I'm going to be presenting something that's perhaps a slightly different approach to what's been discussed already, and I hope that it is relevant and perhaps can generate some discussion. So I'm presenting some work that's based on perhaps some reflections of my previous work. I was a consultant with Oxford Policy Management in their official statistics portfolio. And a lot of the work we did was around building capacity within the official statistics world and with national statistics offices. And I'm going to explain what I mean by each of those in a second. It is joint work with Cora Mesger, who unfortunately isn't here today, but she has definitely helped a lot of the thinking in this presentation. And she currently works at the University of Oxford. So I'll get right into it. Oh, thanks. So just as an introduction or a motivation behind what I'll discuss, I guess we're all in agreement that we are witnessing a so-called data revolution. Now, what I would mean by this is that we're seeing quite new and innovative ways of analyzing data and of visualizing data. So, for example, machine learning and predictive models, small area estimation, and visualization through sort of interactive dashboards or quite advanced mapping. But also, in addition to the sorts of new methods, we also see new data sources and new data producers as well. And I think this is a lot of what we've been talking about today, how we can fit this into the sorts of data system. But there is a challenge around ensuring with all these new methods, with all these new data sources and data producers, there's still a challenge of ensuring the quality, consistency, and usability and the governance of this data. So I'm going to be discussing this in a bit, and perhaps answering some questions around official statistics. So how do the new forms of data complement official statistics, and what is the role of the National Statistical Office or in this data revolution and in modern times? So I'll move to the next slide now. So just an outline, I'll explain what the National Statistical Office is, how it's engaged with the data revolution so far. I'm also going to give two examples of how the Statistical Office has engaged with these non-traditional data sources, one from Rwanda, one from Indonesia. I'm then going to go over some of the opportunities that we have, and then challenges, and how the modern NSO, so National Statistical Office, could address some of these challenges. Next slide, please. So the National Statistical Office is considered the core of the official statistical system. So it's a government department referred to in the UK as the Office of National Statistics, but it would have different titles depending on the country. Also varying status, ranging from completely independent to part of, let's say, the Ministry of Planning. It's created in order to compile, interpret, and make public official statistics. It's governed by 10 fundamental principles. So there's the so-called UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics that encourage independence, adherence to quite strict quality standards, as well as the transparency and dissemination of official statistics. And these guidelines are perhaps what is meant to provide trust, or ensure that users ultimately trust the data that's being released by the National Statistical Office. Whether this is actually happens, I think we see to varying degrees. So is the National Statistical Office still fit for purpose, or is it too old school? So should we still be relying on the so-called creaky wheels of government bureaucracy for our vital economic data? So that this was from a paper by Sullivan Resinger, who've actually come up with a private data company in the US that's tracking economic growth and unemployment in real time, rather than following what the US Statistical Office would produce. So the reasons why I guess people are questioning the National Statistical Office is that there have been many cases of questionable data, especially in developing countries. So for example, we know the example of Ghana's GDP growing by 60% overnight because of a simple correction of the price rebasing. And I would really recommend this book, Poor Numbers, that describes quite a lot of these problems that exist with, I guess, suspicions of data that's being used in developing countries and as the basis of policy. We're also seeing that there are huge data gaps. So still, despite there being national statistical offices, they're often not able to meet quite a lot of the data demands, a lot of which has increased since the introduction of the SDGs. And then in conflict-affected areas, it's quite difficult to collect data. So we're seeing in Yemen, in Afghanistan, for example, there's quite scarce information of what's happening. So I'll move to the next slides, please. So what has been done? What am I talking about when I say the data revolution? So I mentioned machine learning, artificial intelligence, and predictive models, interactive visualizations, but also big data, other data sources. So administrative data sources, like perhaps what Asif was describing earlier, and then big data sources such as social media, mobile phone data, citizen-generated data, etc. So I like to think of it through the three C's, which is perhaps in opposition to the three V's of volume, velocity, and variety. But the three C's refer to crumbs, and I think that's a nice way of putting it, because in a lot of ways, big data is perhaps the leftovers, or what is not actually intentionally prepared for analysis, but can be found, let's say, on the internet by other projects, for other purposes. But we also need the capacity to transform that into something beyond just the crumbs, into something that's actually quite useful. And perhaps this is where data governance does come in as well. We also need to use it for the purpose of delivering to communities, and it does come from communities themselves. So there's that community element to it. I'll move to the next slide. So far, official statistics have been taking note of what's been happening. They've perhaps not gone as far as we would like, but there are quite a lot of working groups, initiatives at the international level. There is a United Nations Global Working Group for Big Data, and then the more traditional fora of statistics have been focusing on this recently. The UN Global Pulse is definitely one to look out for. They've done some really interesting work with national statistical offices, one of which I will describe in a second. And then national statistical offices, mostly in the Western world, have started to pilot some studies to see how they can complement traditional data sources with big data. The UK and Rwanda have set up data science teams. But there's still a lot more happening within academia and the private sector that hasn't been tapped into. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to just describe an example from Rwanda. This is actually is extracted from a paper in Science from a couple of years ago now already. And this was quite an interesting case study, and one of the first where I think we've realized the potential that big data could have in filling quite key data gaps, in this case, poverty. So the authors used anonymized data from the largest mobile phone company in Rwanda. It's quite unique. Rwanda is unique in that it has a monopoly of coverage. This mobile phone company has a monopoly of coverage, whereas most countries will have multiple companies, making data management slightly trickier. But using this data, they took a subsample of 800 individuals, so quite few from the billions of phone call interactions they originally had, and did a short survey interview asking about asset ownership, housing characteristics, and the key variables used for measuring poverty. They did an in-sample prediction of these 800 individuals to predict poverty, and estimated a quite robust model to predict their wealth. And then this was applied out of sample for the 1.5 million phone users. So in the map, you can see how this is the out of sample predictions that are reported at quite a very disaggregated level. And if we compare this to what the official statistics was previously able to produce, this was at the district level, and there are 30 districts in Rwanda. So we're looking at around thousands of localities here where we can estimate poverty levels. And the authors found a very high correlation between this poverty data and the demographic health survey, which is usually used to measure wealth. But again, not at the level that we would ever imagine here. So that's the first example. Second example on the next slide, please. So this is looking at Indonesia. So this was a collaboration between the Indonesian Statistical Office, UN Global Pulse, and Twitter. And the motivation behind this was In 2014, Jakarta was investing in a new transport system and quite a lot of infrastructure investments, and wanted to understand a bit more about commuting patterns. So the Statistics Office did a commuter survey and found out quite a lot of information on patterns, but it took around 1 year from the sort of inception of the survey to its delivery of results. It took a year for this to happen. So the UN Global Pulse came in and thought, well, can we try and do this quicker? And if we do, how robust are the results? So they used Twitter. Now, Jakarta is considered apparently the Twitter capital of the world. It's quite prolific in its usage. And so this project created origin destination statistics. And by this, the method they used was to look at tweets sent out between 7 and 9 a.m. in the morning, and then again at rush hour at 5 p.m. And they took for each user the sort of most common location, and they listed that as the origin. They listed that as the destination. And then for the origin statistics, they took the second most used location throughout the rest of the week and outside of the peak hours. So with the Statistics Office, they were able to calibrate these statistics using population weights as well as Twitter coverage weights that they probably wouldn't have had without this collaboration. And then they compared these origin destination statistics with what the commuter survey found. Now, you'll see these two figures on the right-hand side is the commuter survey, so the sort of official statistics, and then on the left-hand side is the Twitter results. And I'm actually might be confusing them, but it doesn't make much of a difference because, as you can see, they're practically identical. There was a 0.97% or 97% correlation between the two. So both of these examples show, I mean, they're quite successful examples because they show quite a high correlation between what could be produced by official statistics versus more innovative methods using big data. And I think it highlights some of the opportunities that I'll go into in the next slide. So yeah, I guess the first one is quite obvious, more fine-grained and real-time data. And I think it's clear that, you know, a commuter survey that it shouldn't take 1 year, but it did versus this the same results that are available quite easily. And I think that this is going to be quite helpful for SDG indicators that require quite disaggregated groups, so by gender, but also disability status and education status, and then by quite localized geographical location. It is a lot cheaper to be using big data versus expensive surveys. We are reducing the burden on respondents. I know cases like in small countries such as Lebanon, the burden on respondents is so high that people are not responding to surveys anymore, and we see cooperation rates of around 60%, which is quite bad for the quality of the data. And then the last point, which I think perhaps should be caveated with a few things related to, you know, data privacy concerns, but the public can feel a lot more connected to these sources of data, which might seem more real and have larger coverage. But obviously we need to talk about challenges. We can't just talk about the opportunities. So I'll go to the next slide. And, you know, we've touched on quite a lot of this throughout the panel, but there are a lot of governance and ethics issues. A second point, which probably hasn't come up as much, is there are a lack of controls or frameworks for monitoring the quality of data and its analysis. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the fundamental principles of statistics encourage or force statistical offices really to adopt quite strict data quality frameworks that data producers from a private sector, let's say, would not have to follow. Then a big thing is around the exclusion of certain groups, and I think that we have seen this already in India in some of the cases mentioned, that those who don't have an online presence, who don't have access to certain digital systems could be excluded. We're also seeing that because there are so many different data sources that there are inconsistent results sometimes. So what the statistical offices says could be different to what the big data is telling us. So there was a county in the US that analyzed sewage data to measure the count the population, and they found that the census data was off by 5%. And so all of this can lead to the National Statistics Office being disempowered and actually unable to fulfill its mandate because of, I guess, the other data producers at play. So next slide, please. So the question I had at the beginning, what is the role for the National Statistical Office? Is there still a need for it? The answer is yes, and I did base part of my career on this, so might be a little bit biased. But yes, there definitely still is a role. The Statistical Office should ensure that data needs are met and that data is still demand-driven, rather than coming from the private sector and perhaps not necessarily analyzed or produced for the purpose of meeting data demands. The Statistics Office should provide independence and neutrality, although this isn't always the case. And, someone acting on behalf of the government versus on behalf of the private sector, I'm not sure which is better. We also still need traditional data to train data modules and triangulate data. So in both of the examples that I gave, we did see this triangulation, and we saw in the first example that the data needed to be trained using traditional sources. One thing that I think we're missing is statisticians have quite a lot of skills and experience that could be used for the analysis of this data. So a lot of the high frequency big data sources have non-normal distributions. This is quite a well-known fact, but we haven't been doing anything about this so far. I think I am out of time, so I think I'll skip to the last slide. So I'll just go over this quickly. There are four sorts of building blocks for a knowledge secure society, and I think that the NSO can play a role in delivering on these four things around the availability, the utilization of data, ensuring that people are able to actually analyze it, access it, and also ensuring the safe and stable storage of the data. I have one last slide on further conclusions, and perhaps I can end there. Thank you. I'll finish there.
Excellent. Thank you, Alia. I don't see any questions or raised hands at the moment, so perhaps we'll leave it there as well. I have some questions and thoughts which I'm excited to raise during the discussion, so I'll hold on to those. Thank you very much. I believe Stella is up next, so I will just load her slides. Stella, you can bring yourself on stage if you like.
Can you hear me, Eric?
I can hear you fine, yes, thanks.
Okay, so that means everyone else can.
Yes.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for listening in. My name is Stella Odiase. I'm a PhD researcher at IDS. Just a big thank you to Eric for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to co-convene this panel with him. I must say I've learned a lot just working with him to organize this over the past couple of months. Because we're pressed for time, I will not be running through every single slide on my presentation. I'll just focus on sort of like the high points and the issues that they throw up for further reflection and for further discussions. So my presentation is structured around three stories. I am originally Nigerian, even though I'm currently in the UK doing my PhD. And there's three stories that happened in my home country, but which have interesting nuances from a transnational perspective and raise a couple of issues. So I'll tell you about these three stories and what they say to me and what perhaps they mean in terms of the broader conversation around data governance. Now, the first of these stories happened in 2015. Nigeria was due for another general election. And as is the case with every general election, there were entrenched interests in the country who needed the incumbent to come back to power because of the access it gave them to certain opportunities, certain mercantilist interests, etc. And so one of these was a billionaire, a Nigerian billionaire, who somehow fished out Cambridge Analytica, paid them $2 million and said, just do what you do, whatever you need to do to keep the incumbent in power, please do go ahead. And according to the whistleblower who told us told the general public what actually happened, who happened to be a co-founder of Cambridge Analytica, what they did was to, like Eric alluded to during his presentations, to harvest off data off of Facebook. In the Nigerian case, they worked with an Israeli firm that helped them hack into people's personal data as well, without their permission. And the way he described it, they took this personal data and were able to get a sense of people's fears, what they feared the most, what their political leanings were. And the strategy was to cast the opponent such that he resembles what they fear the most. So for the opponent at that time in 2015, what they gathered online was that a lot of Nigerians were worried about Boko Haram, the insurgency, and oh my goodness, what are we going to do? They're bombing up everywhere. And they were also worried that some of the gains that had been recorded with respect to women's rights would be rolled back. So what Cambridge Analytica did, in the words of the whistleblower, was to begin to whisper into the ears of individual voters, one after the other, and say to them, this guy, he's a Boko Haram sympathizer. He's actually one of their sponsors. He hates women. And so they began to prey on people's fears and messing with the collective psyche of a whole country. And they kept at that. It didn't matter whether it was true or false. They just kept at it. Coincidentally, Cambridge Analytica, from the whistleblower's account, didn't just mess with the psyche of Nigerian citizens. You see the slide we have up there, you see the flags of other countries where they interfered in elections. You have the Kenyan flag up there. The Nigerian flag is in the middle. Of course, the 2016 elections in America, and the whistleblower claims they also influenced the Brexit voting process in the UK, which is why you have the Union Jack right there. So that is story number one. Now, what is the second story? The second story happened last year, 2019. Now, after Cambridge Analytica did what they did, and the whistleblower blew the whistle, as it were, the government decided to set up a committee to investigate. But then there was a challenge. Apparently, there were gray areas in the law, right? So we have laws that speak to what to do when people commit offenses, when people do things that they're not supposed to do. But there was a gray area in terms of, so what happens when a transnational entity breaches certain codes and certain standards? What do we do with a transnational entity that preys on the data of Nigerian citizens and misuses that data without their consent? That was a gray area. And the committee wasn't sure what to do about that. And till date, I've been asking for the report from that committee investigation, but it hasn't been made public yet. Now, presumably in response to the Cambridge Analytica story, a private member in the lower chamber within the national legislative arm decided to to become a foot soldier for this anti-social media bill. The official name is the Protection from Internet Falsehood and Manipulation Bill of 2019. What that bill essentially seeks to do is to give the Nigerian government regulatory control over conversations on social media platforms. And of course, there's been a lot of pushback around this. At the time Eric approached me for us to co-convene this was a topical issue back home. One of the things I find interesting about this bill and about the story around it is that it got a very quick fast track through the parliamentary process. So bills take quite a while to go through different readings, first reading, second reading, public hearings. This one went like real quick, and before we knew it, it was at the final stage. It hasn't been passed into law yet, but you can see from the picture I have up there on the slide, there's been different types of protests and resistance against it. Interestingly, while the public hearings were going on, both governmental and non-governmental entities or bodies pushed back and condemned this bill. Apart from two, the Nigerian army made a showing at the public hearings, interestingly, and made it clear that they think the bill is a really good idea. And so did the Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs. So the bill got support from those two blocs, and of course from the private member who was sponsoring the bill. It was actually alleged that this bill was a copy and paste version of the Singaporean bill, and it was very aggressive. It was breaching certain codes of democratic standards and practice. So that's the second story. Now, the third story happened a little bit earlier. Let me pull up there you go. Happened in 2014 in April, and some of you might have heard about this, when 276 schoolgirls aged between 9 and 13 were abducted by Boko Haram extremists from an all-girls boarding school where they were in school to write their exams, and they were boarding there. There's all sorts of facts emerged after that. The Federal Ministry of Education had said schools in this area shouldn't be open at this time, but the state government sort of like left the school open and encouraged the girls to actually go in there and spend the next 2 weeks there waiting to write their GCE exams. The principal of the school made sure her daughter, who was eligible to write the exams, wasn't there within those 2 weeks, and she ordinarily would have been. And so when the insurgents struck, of course, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories floating around as to why did the state government leave this school open when it was supposed to be shut? And why did the principal not bring her daughter to school when she would ordinarily have been there for those 2 weeks? So they abducted these girls ostensibly to become wives, wives to the terrorists and sex slaves. And what started as a group of protests, you can see the picture there as well. This is men, women, across all walks of life, mobilizing like every single day. I remember I was in Abuja at the time, and every single day at the Unity Fountain in Abuja, there were people dressed in red just carrying placards. And the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls was conceived or conceptualized in response to the Boko Haram abductions in northeastern Nigeria of 2014. Now, this hashtag became a global rallying cry. It became a global social media rallying cry. And we had all sorts of important, well-known people holding up these placards saying, bring back our girls. And it brought tremendous pressure to bear upon the government of the time to find these girls and to bring them back. So that was the power of social media harnessed for some good. Now, what do these three stories say to me, and what kinds of things have they got me reflecting on generally and with respect especially to data governance? For me, I think, first of all, they even raised the question of what is data governance? What does it mean? In a context where transnational interests and transnational entities are increasingly intersecting with the local and with the national, what does accountability mean within that context? What does justice mean within that context? And in a world where transnational corporations are being increasingly nudged to play bigger roles in the development agenda. What does accountability mean within that context? And what does data governance even mean within that context? And what are the new routes for challenging and holding powerful actors, including transnational actors, to account? Because I think it's really possible for transnational actors to feed into existing national political hegemonies through distortions in data governance. And that's something that can happen where the systems and the institutions that are supposed to govern and oversee what's going on within this sphere, within this space, are not strong enough, not as strong as they should be. So to what extent can perceptions of justice shape accountability within the context of data governance, assuming we agree on what data governance actually means? There are a couple of other reflections as well. I mean, we've seen how social media continues to energize the forums for promoting citizens' engagement and political activism. It does present new ways to stimulate citizens' engagement in the public space, like what we had with the Bring Back Our Girls movement. There's also the Ehsaas hashtag, which was coined in response to the high incidence of police brutality that we started witnessing in 2018 and 2019. And this online data-driven, social media-driven campaign was able to move the presidential villa to say, okay, you know what, we're actually going to end. SARS is the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. It's a unit of the police. They've known to be very aggressive, and God help anyone who they think is an armed robber. And they've actually thought that a couple of people who are not armed robbers are armed robbers and done unspeakable things to them. But that got the attention of those in authority. So that was a force for good. So properly managed, where there's proper oversight, data and the platforms that present data or collate data wield monumental potential for control. But there's also the potential for manipulation, which is where the question of what governance means, what justice means, what accountability means, all come into play. In the course of reflecting on some of this, I read an article by Pinto, and he was talking about, are we sliding into an era of digital colonialism, where, you know, certain countries who are at certain levels of development sort of like swoop in and dive in and take advantage of weak accountability and governance systems to do as they please. It also speaks to the character of elections worldwide, because for the stories that make up my presentation, it's been a lot about meddling in elections and using data to meddle in elections in a way that's, I mean, it's if you listen to the Nigerian story and you listen to the painting or the depiction of other figures in the other countries that Cambridge Analytica meddled into, you could see them playing on the fears of people, very extreme of their fears, and saying, this person represents all of that, so run away from him, don't, or her, don't run towards them. So what's going on now is we do have a bit of a challenge in terms of how to prevent simplified online politics from being the main vehicle of political discourse, because millennials tend to bump into political information instead of actively seeking it, and they're undeniably influenced by what they see online. And I'm not sure how governance, data governance, speaks to this, but I think I was saying to Eric the other day when we were having a conference call preparing for this session, I said to him, I said, when you thought of this panel last year, none of us knew that there would be a COVID, or that we'll be so reliant on social media platforms to talk to each other to get our work done. So the demand for clarifying what data governance means, what it means when there's that intersection between the transnational and the local, I think that demand is greater now than ever before. And it calls for some form of collective reflections, especially because it highlights potentially problematic challenges to the nation state and the whole question of state sovereignty, and how far can the state go and how far can transnationals go. These broader concepts actually form the basis of my PhD research. the whole question of transnational accountability in today's world, where transnational interests and representation is featuring more across sectors, across spheres, and a bit more worryingly across the development space. And yeah, I think I'm almost done, Eric. Thank you for the 5-minute reminder. Trying to move this. Yes, and I am done. So thank you for listening, and maybe we could reflect on some of these issues together during the discussions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That was excellent and ties into several themes that were discussed today so far. So I believe we have one last presentation today, Martin. So I'll let you go, Stella, and load the next presentation.
Thank you, Eric.
All right. Yes, can hear you fine. Thank you. So just let me know and I'll advance the slides for you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
So I'm going to talk today about a paper that I've worked on with a couple of colleagues, Rasmus Christensen, who's a research associate at International Centre for Tax and Development at IDS, where I'm also based, and Daisy Dai, who's a co-author based in Shanghai at the University of Finance and Economics there. And the paper that we worked on together was aiming to understand changes in the position of China in the global economy and the ways in which that has impacted on its engagement with global tax negotiations. In the context of this panel, I think some of the parts of that paper are more relevant and some less. So given the time, I'm going to talk for a bit about some things which are not so much in the slides, and then I'm going to talk about the bits of the slides that are most relevant to this panel, and probably skip over some of that. So listening to some of the presentations, I think it's good just to set out how this fits in a panel on data governance. Because I guess most of the discussion about data governance has been about a nexus of issues around privacy and data localization requirements and government intervention and so on. Here we're talking about a slightly different question, but I think it's part of the same nexus of issues, which is around taxation. So how do governments ensure that they're able to get a fair share of tax revenue from businesses in the digitalized economy? And in that context, I think we need to understand what's changed or what is changing as the economy digitalizes that's challenging in the tax context. So I think it's really helpful here to use the analysis that Shoshana Zuboff gives in her book, where she talks about data capitalism, surveillance capitalism, as being this entirely new type of business model in which what businesses are doing are extracting what she calls behavioral surplus. So the data is I think Amrita talked about data as capital. In my analysis, I'm seeing data as a natural resource, in some ways parallel to mineral resource in a developing country, say, which digitalized companies are extracting, exporting, and monetizing for their own profitability. It's a resource which is not particularly owned by anyone in the developing country, but when it's extracted, it can be monetized, and then it becomes owned by the company concerned. And that's different to traditional business models that we have been used to seeing in a number of ways. Most pertinently, it's not having the ability to extract that resource is not dependent necessarily on having direct investment in a country. You don't need to build a mine to extract data. You don't even need to be physically present in a country necessarily to extract large amounts of data. Or at least if you are physically present, it doesn't necessarily need to be a large presence that's commensurate with the amount of value that you can extract from that country. And that's very different to the way in which the tangible economy works, and it's been very challenging for international tax rules, as I'll explain in a minute. Another big difference is the extent to which transactions in the digitalized economy take place on a bartering basis. I thought it was quite interesting. We had discussion internally within IDS about the use of WhatsApp and the ways in which it might be GDPR compliant or not. One of the things I realized in that discussion is that once you understand the business model that underlies WhatsApp, which is to give you a free product in return for which you give data on your location, on your contacts and so on, on your interactions with your contacts to the Facebook Corporation, you understand that it couldn't possibly be GDPR compliant based on that model, because what it's about is harvesting data and supplying it to a US corporation. And so those bartering transactions look very different to the transactions we're used to seeing, in which money changes hands in return for the provision of a good or service. And again, can we start on the first slide? Yeah. Again, that really challenges our understanding of how the economy works. And I think the other point about that is that business models are not visible. As some of the presentations have been talking about, it's quite hard for people to necessarily understand how data is used by companies. How data is used by companies to how their business models work, what value different parts of different provisions of service, different actions by consumers might have. So all of that has been incredibly challenging for the global tax regime, because the starting point for that regime is that in order for a country to be able to tax a multinational corporation, it has to have a physical presence inside that country. It has to have a direct investment there, so tangible assets or employees. Or if it's providing a service, it only becomes taxable in a country if the provision of the service takes place in a fixed place for more than a certain period of time. And developing countries, although they didn't write the rules that make that the case, they've signed up to them on a massive basis through concluding bilateral treaties and adopting OECD model rules into their tax laws. And all of a sudden, those rules actually prevent countries that import digital services from taxing the companies which are supplying those services and monetizing them. That's not just been a problem for developing countries; it's been tremendously controversial in developed countries too. Has really created a fracture in the global tax regime, which we're seeing. Just yesterday, there was big news that the US has formally pulled out of the negotiations that are trying to adjust its national tax rules to adapt to this new situation. So it's proving really challenging to reach agreement. In that context, in the paper, we look at the role of China. And I think the key point here is if you look at if you talk about the power shift from the West to China and to some extent India, and you look purely at direct investment, which is how people generally analysed power politics in the global tax regime and in many other aspects of the global economy, you wouldn't necessarily conclude that there has been such a radical shift as you would if you look at the data-driven economy, because in the data-driven economy, China is second only to the US in terms of exports of digital services. It's far and away more important as a digital service provider than any of the European countries. And so that power shift is much more visible. And that's the broad context of the paper. So with that in mind, I'm going to go on to my slides now. So in the paper, what we do is we talk about these two dynamics which are changing China's engagement with global tax governance. So the first is growth of Chinese multinational companies, and in particular digital multinational companies. So China as a much more increasingly an outward investing country as opposed to a recipient of investment. And secondly, we talk about the shift from G7 to G20 governance of the global economy. And then we talk about three cases, and I'm going to dwell only on the first one really in this discussion. Next slide, please. So, so in terms of the growth of Chinese digital multinational companies, so the Chinese government has had for the last few years this dual strategy of going out and bringing in. So on the one hand, the aim is to promote the expansion outward of Chinese firms, be they state-owned or not state-owned. And that's resulted in China shifting from a net capital importing position to a net capital exporting position. If you look at flows, of course, if you look at stocks, China is still an overwhelmingly capital importing country, but it's now become a net capital exporter on a flows basis. and that changes very much its incentives in terms of how it wants the taxation of multinational companies to work, given the extent to which those decisions are taken at a global level. But secondly, it's still also focusing very much on bringing investment into the economy, and also trying to transform the way in which its domestic economy works, both by shifting towards being much more of a demand-driven economic model. So it's the Chinese consumer market is the most economic in the world. Oh, can't hear me very well. Sorry to hear that. I'll lean a bit closer to the computer, but if my Wi-Fi is problematic, there's nothing I can do about it. Okay. And the second thing is by trying to shift from being primarily at the manufacturing stages of value chains towards what it calls full value chain. So to shift one side of the smile curve towards much more intensive research development and intellectual property on the product development side, and then also on the other end, much more marketing functions as well. And you can see that trend if you look at the three major Chinese digital multinational companies. So Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba. So we tend to, when we're thinking about the digitalized economy, to think about the really big companies. But these big Chinese companies are actually up there amongst the largest digital companies in the world, certainly Tencent and Alibaba. I think for context, Facebook's market capitalization is maybe about 4 times that of Tencent. So they're not as big, but they're in the same league as the American companies. Next slide, please. So then Daisy might supply with this, which shows you the Chinese companies that are equivalent to the Western companies that most of us on this call are probably more familiar with. So you can see that for every Western product, every Western company, there is a Chinese equivalent. And the main important thing to think about this is to note that the Chinese market for digital services is very different to either the American or the Chinese or even the African or Indian market, because it is protected. So largely not for economic reasons, but nonetheless the quite strict requirements that limit the ability for a foreign company to permeate the Chinese domestic market and place strong obligations on it if it wants to, mean that Google and Facebook are not competitive in China. They're not really, they've to some extent withdrawn from trying to enter into that market, and the Chinese homegrown alternatives have occupied that space. They haven't just stayed in the Chinese market, they've then exported outwards as well. So China is uniquely like the US in the sense of having a largely domestically dominated digital services market in its own country, and also investing out at those companies, also moving out, investing and providing services in other countries. Next slide, please. And if you want to talk about things like the Internet of Things or artificial intelligence, these are areas where China has a really leading role, partly because with that very large market and very large multinationals, it has a huge supply of data. And data is, as I mentioned before, it's the thing that it's the raw commodity that you process to create digital services, digital products. And in the Chinese case, it's the amount they have enables them to really be up there with only really the US in terms of the amount of data they have that they can use to, for example, train artificial intelligence. Next slide. So that economic trend coincides with the political trend, which is the shift since the global financial crisis to govern their global economy, not through the G7, but through the G20. And why that's important in taxation terms is because traditionally the G7 was the political mandate body and the OECD was the implementing body. Whereas all G7 members are members of the OECD, half of the G20 members are not. So it's really changed the way in which global tax negotiations take place, and these negotiations determine where multinational companies pay taxes. because those negotiations can't purely in the OECD environment they did before. They have to now take place with a broader constituency in which China and India are particularly influential. At the same time, China actually has quite China has in some ways a weaker position than, say, India for a couple of reasons. One is that China has actually been, over the last few years, the bringing in priority has caused it to want to converge with the approach to taxation you see in OECD countries. It's not quite as distinctive a path as India has. On the other hand, China also has quite a weak central tax administration because it's decentralized to the provincial level. So it doesn't have the same policy making and administrative capacity centrally that OECD or India would have. So what China does is it follows OECD standards, but it customizes them in the way that it applies them. Next slide, please. Okay, so those are the two dynamics. And then I'm just going to talk about the first case, the G20 OECD negotiations. So next slide, please. So, so to explain the context here, so the global financial crisis, there's been a huge politicization of the taxation of multinational companies. It was very contentious. You've probably all seen news about being very angry about whether it's Google or Starbucks or whoever doesn't pay enough tax. And since 2013, governments have been negotiating in a process steered by the G20 but taking place at the OECD to adapt global tax rules to make it harder for companies to avoid tax. So in the first round of those negotiations in 2017, China, and that wasn't so much focused on the digital economy, China's approach was largely supportive, to go along with what the OECD countries wanted and push for relatively minor changes that would give it a slightly bigger share of the ability to tax inward investment into the Chinese economy. Because that made sense. In effect, China was kind of allied with other emerging economies and developing in that negotiation as a predominantly capital importing country. But when it came to the more recent negotiations beginning in 2018, which focuses on digitalized companies in particular, China has gone very quiet. And in fact, more recently, it's emerged as an obstacle to global agreements in a way that only the US also is acting as an obstacle. And the reason for that is that in the digital sector, it's very different. China has no interest in seeing a shift towards greater share of the tax being paid in the countries where in market countries where they sell things, because it's got a protected market. Instead, China has outward investment, and so its inherent interest is in preventing that shift that is what's on the table in the negotiations. And the only other country in that same position is the US. So it seems that China's acted less like a developing country in these negotiations and much more like not any developed countries, but particularly like the US. And that's the kind of way that we're seeing negotiations looking at the moment. So I think I'm not really going to talk about the rest of the slides. I'm just going to say then that I think what's interesting here is that the change to the way the economy works and the shift towards digitalized business models, it has not merely prevented policy challenges for governance, but it's also changed very much the way in which power operates at the global level. It's changed the interests, but also the power distribution, and it's empowered, in this case, China in particular, as well as giving China a slightly different set of interests. So I'll stop there in what I've got to say. I hope that the connections with what other papers come across a bit more from the way I've talked about it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, Martin. Yeah, that was very interesting. And I like how it was different from a lot of the other talks, but also fit in nicely. Yeah, I'll just drop you there. I guess there are no questions specifically for Martin. Great. Well, that was the last presentation for today for our 2 sessions. So let's open up for some questions or discussion. I'm going to bring Stella up here, and then let's change this and enable an open podium Okay. So we did have a couple of questions, or we have 3 questions that were posted earlier. So we can start with those. So I urge anyone who's out there to add more questions. I've also opened up a podium here on the stage, so you can bring yourself onto the stage and be able to speak to the crowd in the same way that Stella and I are doing. So if you're familiar with the sort of fishbowl approach, we can have some open spaces on stage. People can come and ask something or make a statement and then step back. And then that way we can all speak if that works. Otherwise, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, do leave a question or raise your hand. Yeah, so the questions we have so far, Martin asked about digital services companies competing. That was to Amrita. I think she answered it at the time. But of course, we could think about it again in light of Martin's own talk. Yeah, I'm particularly interested in thinking about the data governance angle there, because I think Martin was talking about digital services, including data services or data-driven companies, and the impact that has on China's behavior vis-a-vis taxation, which is really interesting. And Martin mentioned that it's different from how India tends to behave. So just thinking a bit deeper about the governance of data implications, since we've spent quite a lot of time on both of the talks, thinking about the implications of the data on governance issues, governance of trade or governance of taxation. Either of you could jump in and speak to that if you like. Otherwise, Atika has also asked me about the DataSmart strategy since it draws on Aadhaar, which is the Indian version of the digital biometric identity system that Atika talked about. Her talk was about the Pakistan side, a similar kind of thing. Will it lead to the exclusion of minority populations in accessing public services who've been denied citizenship in the past? And yes, that is a concern. And in fact, a lot of the criticism over Aadhaar has been about the fact that it can be exclusive. So in a typical, contemporary sense, Aadhaar was designed to be inclusive, in fact, universal, to make everyone on the same footing vis-a-vis the state, in a context where many people were historically excluded from any kind of official identity, any kind of official acknowledgement that they were born and had a life, intended to interact with the state through informal means. But ironically, or perhaps naturally, as we see, when we try to impose a technological solution onto these things, it certainly can have that intended effect, but many people who were managing just fine with those informal means found themselves cut off by needing to go through a formal means, and were therefore worse off because of that. And so if we think about building an entire stack of economic activity and interlinked digital ecosystem of companies, which are basing their activity on biased and faulty or exclusive or exclusionary, information via an Aadhaar data set, then yes, it would bake in those exclusions and discriminations into that new digital realm, which, as we know, is creating lots and lots of wealth for those who are able to participate. So yeah, that's a major. Yeah, I guess the implication there is that it flips the issues from being, what is privacy, and where are the limits? We don't want the state, or we don't want companies to misuse data, to, what happens if we don't include people and leave them behind in a world where, this is the new, driver of livelihoods and wealth. So, and then Atika has also asked, Alia, do you think the location GPS data can be used in countries with strict data protection regulations, especially for identifying COVID-19 cases? So that also raises some really interesting points. Alia, you're welcome to come up to the podium if you want to address that question directly. I mean, we had some really interesting discussion about supplementing official statistics with big data and supplementing big data with official statistics. And an interesting thing is happening in our project in India, which maybe Asif could speak to, looking to take advantage of some big data to strengthen government sort of predictive abilities and real-time response to COVID-19 specifically. So I'll just leave that there. Maybe he can speak to it. I'm not up to speed on that part of the project at the moment, but go ahead, Alia.
Yeah, sure. So I don't know if Asif was talking about a specific country or just where there are strict regulations. I mean, the analysis that was done in Indonesia was based on anonymized data. And I think that this is perhaps a missing step between the sorts of private companies and those who are analyzing the data, is having some kind of agency who is responsible for ensuring that the data is anonymous. In fact, I mean, perhaps I could also, before I complete this response, there is a question from Gareth about what issues might there be on relying on private companies for public statistics and on regulating such companies, and have any countries addressed this through legislation? So the answer is no, not sufficiently. So traditionally, most countries will have a statistics law, although not all do. And the statistics law is perhaps comes out of the official statistics fundamental principles that I had mentioned, and explains how the statistics office needs to be independent and is mandated to deliver on certain data demands. And the other thing that it does describe in quite detail is the issue of anonymized data. And it's not just a matter of simply removing people's names and identifying information, but even a step further than that in terms of disclosure control, ensuring that no one would be able to analyze data and, for example, pinpoint a certain case based on an interaction of a certain number of variables. So, for example, if you're looking at a survey and you see that there is one doctor in this village, and that village literally only has one doctor, it might be quite easy to identify that person. So the point being that there are very strict rules, usually in statistics laws, around these things, but they will not necessarily apply to the type of data that we've been discussing today. And I think there is a movement to try and think more about these things, and perhaps some of the working groups that I mentioned have done a bit more thinking about it. And then on the other hand, there's also the data protection laws like the GDPR and the law that's under discussion or debate in India at the moment, which would be talking more about the data protection in these data systems. So I think there's still a missing link there in ensuring that data used for analysis, so for example from Twitter, is actually anonymized, and a lot of it is left up to the company to figure that out. And in the EU they would have to follow GDPR, but that doesn't necessarily apply in other countries. So yeah, that's perhaps my response there.
I have a couple of questions.
Stella, do you have anything to add?
Yes, absolutely. I have a few questions. One is for Martin. Thank you for your presentation. I noticed I know you didn't have enough time to go through all the slides, but somewhere in your presentation, in your abstract, you referenced the bipolar structure of the digital economy. And I've never been fascinated by that description. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit what you have in mind there. While you were making your presentation, you also said something along the lines of many of these countries, even the developing countries, have signed up to bilateral treaties which commit them to certain standards. Just to point out that there is a limit to which bilateral treaties can hold some national actors accountable, because in some cases it's required that when you go back to your home country, you pass the bilateral treaty in some form of national law before it comes into effect. So in some contexts, the bilateral treaty is just that, just for show at international level and not enforceable, not justiciable at national level. And then on the smart cities work, I know there's a whole group of you that worked on that, Eric. I'm just wondering about the delineation, when you talk about smart cities, I'm curious, are you just referring to urban areas, or, because there are countries where you have cities in the rural, like some rural areas are cities. So I'm just wondering, when you talk about cities, in unpacking this, is this just, did you take account of the rural-urban divide? Is this just an urban project? Is it something that can work at that other level? I'm just curious. Thank you.
Okay. So your first question was to Martin, right?
Yes.
Okay. So Martin, if you're interested, you can hop up onto the podium or jump into the podium and speak.
There's a question from Amrita in the comment box. I think they kind of slot together slightly. I think, and to try and make the point in a way that's more general relevance here. It seems to me that where we actually are in terms of the development of digitalized economy and regulation of it and taxation of it is in a situation where you have these three distinct realms that act as sources of normative authority and to some extent leadership that can have a coercive impact on other countries, and that's the US, Europe, and China. So I think if I use the term bipolar at some point, I think tripolar, if that is a word, is probably the more pertinent term. I thought it was interesting that in Amrita's presentation, actually, she talked about the US and the Chinese, the US and the European contrast, but not so much about the Chinese approach to data governance, which is different again, in which they, through the digital Silk Road, are also invested in trying to export to some extent. So I think what's quite interesting right now is that it's not entirely clear for other developing countries with which model of governance or with which model of approach to taxation they necessarily have the most in common, because there's arguably difficulties with all of the different approaches. And so I'd be very interested to hear other people's reflections on that. If you're looking at India, for example, which is not in any of those three groups, what's its natural ally most likely to be? On the taxation side, it's definitely Europe, but I don't know if that will be the case in the broader digital governance questions. And for Africa, I think probably the same is my impression. I'd be really interested to hear what others say.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, if anyone wants to speak to that, just bring yourself onto the stage. Otherwise, I'll answer Stella's question about what we mean when we say smart cities. So in India, there's a particular national level an initiative called the Smart Cities Mission, which there's hundreds of cities in India and it was a sort of competition where cities applied to be one member of the mission, and there are currently 100, I believe, cities in India who are officially labeled smart cities because they're participating in the smart cities mission. And then they would be at various stages of actually becoming smart in a substantial sense, of implementing various tech-related projects. Many of them would be rather small cities. So Jabalpur is about 1 million people. It's an older city. Raipur in Chhattisgarh state is a new city of 1 million people, which is also, I mean, if you visited, you might think it's a rural area, but it's labeled a smart city. So yeah, the definitions of what is urban, what is the city, are at play here for sure, and that nuances things. But we have this official label to call something a smart city in India. Asif, welcome to the stage. Feel free to chime in.
Yeah, so we have been talking about lot about privacy in term for data, whether it be in urban context, in any research aspect, or in businesses, or in so. There's a very thin line of these data in terms of, so there are this personal data, but there are this process data which also is there, which may or may not have all those personal information. So a lot of time in various projects which are primarily on data side, so a lot of time privacy becomes the excuse for not doing that project, or not going ahead, or not doing taking initiative which can lead to better efficiency in any of these processes. So we also need in kind of in research also, we need to somehow try to link and delink both of these things. How exactly we can do that? Because process data is something which can be utilized, which can different entities can use it seamlessly at one time, and does not have any personal information. But due to this privacy concern, even the process data doesn't come into picture. Even that process data, people are not able to access that information from various agencies or various silos, and people who are in charge of this data. So even in terms of whenever we try to collect data, even if we don't ask the person's name, even if we don't ask anything related to about that person, but to bring that trust, that yes, your name, your face, or details will not be used, somehow we need to build that trust also in overall process. And for that we need to make people understand that these are two different aspects. Your personal data is a different thing, process data is a different thing, and how people function or city function with all of these things.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. Do you feel like you could speak to the COVID-19 pilot that we're thinking of at the moment, in terms of how you supplement, official data capacities in real time, say, to respond to COVID-19 with big data?
Yeah, so we are in process of trying to use technology to simulate and find out kind of an probable hotspots that may come up with due course of time. Hotspots which may or may not be just because of the regular processes, but because of certain other aspects also. Because now there's a rainy season coming into in India. So how that will impact maybe the location, maybe the hotspots which are coming into. So we are trying to have different layers and aspects, different layers of data, which can then talk to each other. And using artificial intelligence, one can at least be able to find out those hotspots, and based on that, various decision makings can be done. So it's kind of in discussion phase, and we are trying to implement that at least in one city, at least one of the cities in which we are working on.
Great.
Can I perhaps just ask a few questions for Asif? So just on the point that you made earlier about the separation of the identifying information and the process information, and how we build trust on that, I think that is an important issue around ensuring that data remains anonymous. But another issue that perhaps we haven't discussed is around consent, and how people might not realize that they are giving consent for their data to be used in certain ways. And often this is because it's hidden in a lot of legal language and terms and conditions that people don't actually read, or it might not even have been mentioned in that way. So I think it's not just about identifying information, but around how data is being used and for what purpose. And Stella's pointed out a few cases of how it's been used to manipulate people. But the question I had for you was around capacity and the quality of the data. So you've spoken about a few examples already, and I wonder if you've seen any of the quality challenges, so perhaps around duplication of information or certain outliers that are inexplicable. Has this come up as a challenge for you? And so far, I think we've spoken more around how data systems can be used as management tools rather than analytical tools. So I'm just wondering if you've seen the capacity to be doing this in the type of examples I gave around predictive models or poverty analysis. Have you seen the capacity to do these sorts of things in the studies you mentioned?
So, so smart city, to understand it, we need to go into the context of how these smart cities are actually trying to develop these data systems based on which decision makings can be taken at the city level. Number one, so earlier, most of these data, even today, most of these data lie on the record books, which are not primarily digitized. So the first stage is the digitization part, which most cities are trying to do, piloting or implementing projects which can then provide data which are in digital format, which are machine readable, basically, whether it gets generated, automated, or somebody generates it typing on the computer or whatever. So it becomes machine readable. Now, so the analytics part or putting into artificial intelligence part on those data systems, I see somewhere it will take time to include some of these things, because we are in a, you can say, kind of in a phase where people are trying to test some of these aspects, like what kind of a data is coming in, are there loopholes, where if the data. So I'll give you a classic example. One of the in one of the studies, there's an air quality monitoring station. There is an installed air quality monitoring station. So when they saw that monitoring station, or are looking at that, the kind of data they're coming in, so they saw a shoot in the numbers, but at one point it became constant, and it remained constant there. So when they checked the monitoring station, they found out that the inlet of the place from where it is actually trying to monitor or manage or looking at the pollution level is completely choked. So they have to manually clean that part, then again it becomes readable. So there are some of these kind of challenges which still we are trying to figure out and look at, so that we can have a seamless information or data systems which is in place, which even the city managers, anybody can trust. So developing, even seeing at a lot of numbers, the city manager doesn't trust these data, then we have to back up them with other numbers, or cross check those with different from different agencies, that look, this is the number which is correct or not. So we are kind of in a stage of doing those things and managing those part only.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Stella. I found your presentation very interesting. And my question for you is that in the African context, do any digital governance laws exist? I mean, I'm asking this because, you know, it seems that it's quite similar to the status in Pakistan, where, you know, such laws are under, they're still being, they're a bit immature right now, and they're being, there's a lot of efforts so that they can be pushed through the assembly to be passed by, the governing legislation groups over there. So how do social media activists feel by voicing out their opinions on social media, such as Twitter, if there aren't any digital regulation protection laws in place? Because, you know, otherwise sometimes it can cause a lot of dangers and a lot of risks to certain people. So I mean, I'm just wondering, how is it over there, and what do you feel? Any comments?
Yes, thank you, Atika. I actually had a question for you as well, but I haven't had the time to ask it. So let me respond to yours first. I know that this is an emerging issue as far as the African continent is concerned. Speaking specifically to the West African context, which is where I've had the opportunity to do some work, they do have a few policies. Like Nigeria, for instance, just had this policy, a quick executive order that was put in place last year. Again, it's still responding, like, a reactionary thing because of all the hoopla that came from the data governance issues around the elections. But the problem with these laws, like you rightly point out, are the policy. They're not laws yet, because the difference between a law and a policy is that the law carries a threat of a sanction.
Okay, I guess Stella will bring herself back on when she's available. Yeah, I mean, while we wait, I think you mentioned something, Atika, about using the NADRA targeting effectively to remove ineligible recipients. I mean, was there criticism or critique of this? Was there a sense that it was sort of flawless and accurate at determining these things, or was that controversial somehow?
As far as I think targeting is concerned, for the Ehsaas Cash Emergency Program, I think it was really appreciated that using technology to identify ineligible beneficiaries who were previously enrolled on the program was a great thing, because it introduced transparency and visibility in identifying who are the people who are actually eligible. Because what technology did was that it ran a couple of data analytic checks. So it used AI, artificial intelligence, and it checked whether those beneficiaries who were previously enrolled on the program, whether they were whether they had bought a car. So it checked their, so it went through different databases, and it checked whether those recipients who were receiving social cash, whether they had bought a car in the last couple of months, whether they had any assets, whether they were paying any tax. So it identified, so it basically, whether they had a passport made, if they had a travel history, and all these people who were removed were, part of that previously corrupt system before the datafication of the social welfare program. So I think that part was highly appreciated, where technology is being used to actually accurately target eligible beneficiaries and enroll them onto, on the digital welfare state, social cash program. But on the other hand, NADRA on its own has been criticized as well for sharing data with the state, with security agencies, or with other corporations, with banks, without citizens' consent. So I think while it's doing the right thing in a particular sector, facilitating the provision of social cash grants to eligible beneficiaries, on the other hand, there's some underlying regulatory issues which it needs to address when it comes to data sharing and privacy issues regarding citizens. But again, a lot of people in Pakistan, I think they're really not aware of what NADRA is doing. So unless a lot of people don't talk about it or voice their opinions on this, it seems that NADRA would, so it really depends in what jurisdiction NADRA is actually working on, and what is its role where. So that needs to be, I think, monitored a bit more closely.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, a really good point as well, what you said at the end about people being aware. My overwhelming sense is just that if people don't encounter data systems or data processes, it's very hard to have any kind of effective intuition about this stuff. So when we see something like the reaction against Cambridge Analytica, it comes out of nowhere, and it's like, well, you should have been aware that your Facebook privacy settings were such that people could gather this data, but people don't have that intuition to see the risks ahead of time, and then they're surprised. And I wonder, as scholars, in various ways intersecting with these issues, how we take that on as a challenge, or help people experience these things so that they can feel it in a way. Because I mean, even professionals, even in our project experience, professionals who deal with smart city projects and data-driven projects on a daily basis tend to have a simplistic idea about how data could be used or misused. And to answer Alia's question about using these data systems in a kind of analytical way, one of the things we did in our Smart Data for Inclusive Cities project was a field trip to the integrated traffic management body of Delhi, so that monitors buses and the metro and all these things in real time. And for about 10 years, they've been gathering tons and tons of data about traffic flows and patterns and usage, and handing it over to the government bodies who run the transport service. And only in the last year, they tried to set up some kind of analytics capacities. So we know that the bodies, the governing bodies who are running the transport services, were not using that data in any sophisticated way. And the management system itself, only recently and in a kind of ad hoc way. I mean, there were two young men who we met who were in their early 20s and were just really keen to do something with all this data they were collecting. So one of them, okay, go ahead and see what you can come up with. So they're developing on the fly, metrics to see whether a bus driver was cheating on selling the tickets, collecting passengers in one place and only charging them later so he could pocket the extra money or something. And obviously that's not ideal from an analytics point of view. But yeah, I see that the capacities are really limited in a lot of ways to do sophisticated analytics, and yet, I guess the bad actors tend to find ways of getting access and doing what they want with the data. So doing something constructive and building a positive system seems to be much more difficult. Anyway, Stella, did you want to continue your thought from a minute ago? So I guess in the meantime, we'll just direct a question to Martin. You mentioned about Shoshana Zuboff and the surveillance capitalism concept. And I was thinking about discussing this in my presentation as well, about using this surveillance capitalism, the analytical tools around data exhaust and the kind of dust or incidental things that are produced by users of technology that result in kind of big data, which companies like Facebook have managed to monetize and capitalize on as a source of value, like a natural resource. And I wanted to think about what happens when public entities like municipal governments start behaving in the same way. So I pointed out in some of my slides that in the All India data stack, the All India stack, this idea of monetizing that data is explicitly stated there. So I don't know what my question is, but just how can we use these new analytical tools or conceptual frameworks to make sense of things extended beyond what a kind of just capitalist critique of new data enterprises.
That's a really interesting point. I wonder if there'll be something to do on varieties of data capitalism, which looks at how the relationship between the state and the private sector is different in different parts of the world, and what that translates to in terms of data capitalist models. Because in the context of China, we're used to talking about state capitalism, and maybe there is something. I was going to say actually about I think was it in your presentation that you said Cambridge Analytica was the first big public scandal around this topic. I thought, well, actually, no, there was the Edward Snowden revelations, and I think what's interesting was that was a story about government gaining access to private data and using it, and actually it didn't attract the same. It didn't generate the same outrage that the Cambridge Analytica scandal did when we were talking about private sector companies doing in their use. So I wonder if there's something different about public attitudes to one in comparison to the other. I don't know what it is, but I certainly think it's interesting to challenge that assumption that this sort of assumption of private sector bad, public sector good, which underlies probably the Zuboff analysis.
No, I think there's something there about private sector bad, public sector good, or vice versa. But also, what Snowden was saying is that the government was spying on you, or something like that. Something like traditional data, things like your private information, and it probably was a lot of the metadata, phone calls, and things like this, which are essentially big data. But to me, when I heard that, when that story came out, sure, I was outraged, but it felt like, oh yeah, traditional forms of data, government spying on that, which the Cambridge Analytica felt different, because it was like, oh, we didn't even realize, that was data. We didn't even realize that, it's not like they're watching me do something in private. It's just I'm moving around in the world and they're capturing this about me and making inferences in ways that we didn't think was possible, we didn't realize, and then using that to manipulate us. So maybe that's something. But yeah, I mean, I just said the Cambridge Analytica thing is the first, sort of as a heuristic. It's the first one in my mind, the first major time that I noticed people responding to data governance challenges. But I think it's blurred. The lines are getting blurred around the types of data, and therefore the types of governance structures that need to be in place. Which I guess leads me to a question I had towards Alia about in my experience, the city officials tended to be really familiar with public data, like spatial data and things about services, and they'd gone through this process starting about 10 years ago, where they were forced to reckon with open data and the need to make certain types of data publicly available, right? So for them, it was like, well, there's open data, which has no risk because it's open and we can be totally transparent about that. And then there's not open data, which nobody needs to see and it's totally secure and we don't have to worry. So either way, the risks in their mind had been sort of dealt with and put in a little box. Whereas other, the big data things and the things we're just talking about seem totally different, although they're somewhat related. And official statistics groups, again, seem to have had a history of thinking through risks and, what should be public and what shouldn't be public. So I'm interested to think about how these different sets of actors with different sets of intuition and experiences wrestling with these difficult issues could come together and learn from each other and think about the new challenges. Because in my experience, cities in particular seem to cut across these different domains and bring them together in a nexus, so that the silos are no longer as relevant. But I don't know, Alia, do you have any thoughts on that, or does anyone else have thoughts on that? Oh, we can hear somebody. Is that you, Stella? We can hear you now.
Oh, wow.
Excellent. Yeah.
Okay, so I think NADRA did a very good job as far as the targeting of beneficiaries was concerned. They used the poverty scorecard, which was a survey which was based on proxy means testing, and it was actually checking the number of households, of the number of people who were in a household, the number of assets they had, and based on a scale, they identified eligible beneficiaries. So originally, before NADRA introduced the poverty scorecard survey, what was happening was that targeting was being done by politicians. So through digitization and identifying eligible beneficiaries through the poverty scorecard, which was very, very objective, they were able to eliminate a lot of corruption and bring about transparency in the program. Another issue which NADRA was linked with was the disbursement of welfare grants. And since beneficiaries were given identity cards, smart identity cards, they had their thumbprints recorded onto NADRA's database. And as a mode of receiving payments from the government, there were biometric readers in different retailers, point of sale shops. And in order to receive government welfare grants, beneficiaries had to make their thumb impressions, which were actually authenticated against NADRA's database. And if it was the same person, if the same person's thumbprint was matched against NADRA's database, they were eligible to receive the payment. So this actually removed the possibility of other people, of fake digital identities, where other beneficiaries where other people were using fake identities in order to cash out payments which were actually meant for others. So NADRA introduced biometric verification systems not only to target beneficiaries, but also as a modes of authenticating beneficiaries and validating their identities against the national database. And so this is one role which NADRA played, but however, the program also switched to mobile forms of dispersing digital payments, in which this was not done for the emergency cash transfers during the COVID-19 pandemic, but previously mobile banking was used. Beneficiaries were given ATM cards, and this removed the possibility of missed payments or where bribes were taken by politicians who were previously delivering cash payments to beneficiaries at home and asking for bribes. So the shift to digitization and datafication actually did introduce a lot of transparency and visibility in the digital welfare state. However, recently, as I mentioned in this presentation, that there has been some claims that it's punishing some actors and digitally excluding them. But I guess it only probably happened in the context of the the COVID-19 pandemic, where citizens were able to sign up onto the program themselves using their ID cards. And of course, there were some people who didn't have identity cards, and as a result, they weren't able to receive emergency cash in this health emergency situation. So only I think where where it reached out to those beneficiaries who already had citizenship or who already owned biometric smart ID cards. I think in that sense, I would say that there was some form of exclusion. But when it was being initially rolled out through the objective targeting via NADRA, and where where objective household surveys were being done, in that respect, a lot of people were being enrolled onto the social welfare program in Pakistan. I hope this answers your question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see we're starting to lose a few participants. I don't know. I'm happy to stick around a little longer if anyone has anything to discuss. Okay, excellent. Well, I guess no one's jumping into the podiums that are open, so I guess that means we're all spoken out, questioned out. But it was a real pleasure. Thank you, everyone, especially Atika. You're the main person left in the room that I haven't worked with closely before. So thanks for your active contributions. Really great to meet you and hear your work. And I think there's probably some really interesting things we can continue discussing from today. It seems like you're doing very similar work on the Pakistan side to what we're doing on the India side. So really great to hear from you. And thanks so much, everyone, for the great discussion. Getting a few texts in now. What's happening? Let me just check. How will we find funds for sensitization about surveillance capitalism? Yep. Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's a real challenge. It's a challenge of public engagement, I guess. One of the things my pet theory is that to have strong data governance, we need strong digital democracy, I guess, to have these spaces where citizens can encounter the challenges of data and then discuss it with each other and sort of innovate. So it's a challenge of public space and civic engagement. Yeah, so happy to think about that more with you, Sarah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone.